other finger. The one that says, wait a moment. Okay. All right. Well, let's come to order. It's very good to see everybody. This is our second of the 3 planned meetings, I guess, 3 or 4, depending on when we were planning this, of the Revenue Committee. And we'll in Casper at the Oil and Gas Commission, where the restrooms smell like peppermint and cloves. The Casper's always treats us right. So with that, let's call the roll, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Senator Baldwin.
I'm here. I made it, Senator.
But he's online, so he's kind of half.
About 1/4.
Hello, Fred. We hear you. The audio is not very good, but we've got you noted as being present.
Senator James. Here. Senator Pappas.
Here.
Senator Schuler. Here. Representative Baker. Here. Representative Gray.
Here.
Representative Hallinan.
Here.
Representative Henderson.
Here.
Representative Jennings.
Here.
Representative Roscoe.
Here.
Representative Sweeney.
Here.
Representative Yin.
Here.
Chairman Case.
Present.
Co-Chairman Harshman.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Excellent. Well, let's get underway. The very first item of our meeting is the review of distribution of existing revenue streams. This is a task that we've neglected doing for quite some time, and my new co-chairman is going to straighten us out. And I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Your working group met via Zoom. Senator Schuler, Pappas, Sweeney, Henderson, and myself, and we looked at those, and really, as we visited more, our conversation was about trying to shore up this profile for school foundation program. That's really where we continue to show, because as you know, K-12 education is dependent on property taxes, and minerals pay most of our property taxes. And that goes up and down because it's valued at 100% of production. So it goes up with the price dramatically, and also, you know, the production. So it's a hard deal when you look at it. We really can't raise the FMR cap because it affects the state's bonding capacity. Those are kind of more stable in the eyes of credit than general fund type revenues. So we didn't want to change that FMR cap at 200. Then you look at those entities under the cap, and it's hard because there's always winners and losers on the deal. And I think part of that deal has been, you know, YDOT gets a significant amount. Only about 1/3 of that is used for their non-road maintenance type things that you can't use fuel tax for. That's why we have that stream. But about 2/3 of it is used for construction. So that's been an issue, is do we use FMRs for road construction? I don't see us. I just had a little trip across and back across the state, about 600 miles this past weekend. And I think we all recognize our roads are getting worse. Right? And you folks who drove here, it's changing. And so I don't think that's an opportunity. I mean, I just think there's winners and losers in the deal. I think the only probably deal that the work group, and folks can chime in where they like, we talked about the secondary caps and cap flips that we've done in the budget the last couple of years. And I think probably JAC could probably continue that. It's just so unpredictable. And so you're looking for a little stability in our projections. So the only one we really kind of looked at that wouldn't cause any bonding issue or create really losers to certain categories would be to raise that severance cap from the current 155 to 200, and then readjust the percentages. And we've talked about giving that 45 million profiled in school foundation. And part of that is because severance taxes over 50 million a year are collected and from production on school trust lands. And currently, there's not one dime of severance tax that goes to support K-12 education, although those are produced on school land. So that was the only one we thought we'd throw out for maybe discussion. And I certainly let the task force, this is not a hill I'm gonna die on by any means, but throw it out for discussion, Mr. Chairman. So that's kind of where we were at. That's what we learned.
That's pretty quick. How about any other members of the working group? They'd like to chime in? Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd just like to ask a question. How did you look at how all the federal money and like the big infrastructure bill and stuff coming, how that will impact some of these agencies?
Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, the quick answer is no. You know, we're just commanded by statute to take a look at FMR severance and inheritance tax flows. And of course, the inheritance tax, we pretty much take care of. And so as we just looked at those two revenue streams, yeah, that's a broader conversation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other discussion? Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Harshman, what are your thoughts on tying that to some sort of control provisions in terms of the growth in school foundation? I've always thought that I've been opposed to the sort of tax increase agenda, if you will, or attempts. And I think we need to look at some of the revenue flows and combine that with reductions. So, what I was thinking is you have sort of a grand compromise in a bill where you move some funds over school foundation and you tie that to some controls, and especially in the escalator, and maybe you put it in place after some of the federal issues clear, because there are some constraints there, and we don't want to. We got to get guidance on that. But what are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I think if I understand, really, I think, the big escalator in K-12 funding is the number of customers. And we picked up, 10,000 customers in the last 15 years. And that's a big deal. And I think when and so that's the big escalator is the number of students. And of course, the escalators go up and they go down. And so when you talk to school districts that have declining number of customers, that escalator is going down. And so I think, that's a hard thing to I think it's probably two separate discussions, but I think really what we're commanded in this statute is you want to work on these revenue flows or not. And, they were put in place around the turn of the century. So it's not like, and before then there was even more so-called earmarking. And it was an attempt by the legislature to pull more of that back in at that time. So, but anyway, I think we've done our duty on it to look at it. I don't think any of us are charging up any hills. I would urge caution not to probably tinker with the FMR cap. Keep that at 200. And probably the only one that committee talked about that, and our staff, working with our staff on this, of course, was the severance tax. But again, not a hill that I think any of us want to die on, but I want to just talk about. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Let's go ahead. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you discuss a little more your thoughts on the YDOT and their usage of the funds? Are you proposing that maybe there be a change in that, or?
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, be very clear, I do not propose any change to that. And I've always said, though, that highways, it would be, first of all, Wyoming gets a tremendous amount of federal funds from highways. And most of that is fuel tax, a user fee on folks who drive across our highways, on citizens and non-citizens. As we know, truck traffic, most of that's apportioned. So whether they fuel up in Wyoming or Nebraska or Utah, they're going to pay in Wyoming. And And so there's always been kind of a policy piece. I'll talk about fuel tax for a second, Mr. Chairman. You want to kind of have that I-80 tax about the same, or maybe even a penny or two higher than Nebraska and Utah. And as we know, fuel tax, the last time we raised it 10 cents, University of Wyoming study showed it raised the price of gasoline 1 penny, and it raised fuel, I think, 4 cents, diesel fuel. So, but that's a different issue. But this part under the cap on FMRs, only about a third, because our Constitution's fuel tax can only be used for the construction of roads. So you can't use it for driver's license and all those other functions of YDOT. And so that's why we've had this other revenue flow along with some fees and those kind of things that get charged for license and those things. But only about a third of that is used for those non-road construction things. So, but I don't think the working group thought that taking money from YDOT to give to somebody else was a good idea. So that's kind of, and I'm looking around, anybody on our little working group or any members we just weren't going to go there with that.
Mr. Chairman,
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Schuler, and then Katie, do you need something? Hold on a sec. We got one online. Let's get Representative Schuler and then, or Senator Schuler.
I was just going to say, have I been moved to the House? No one told me.
I apologize.
Thank you, Senator. Or
So
Mr.
we're all
Mr.
one
Chair-
here.
Yes,
now.
we
We're
are.
all one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, we had some really good discussions on the secondary caps, and I think Co-Chair Parchman kind of hit the nail on the head. You know, the only thing that makes me, makes everyone, I think, a little nervous is the revenue that we're going to get from our severances. You know, in a good year, like right now, we seem to be having a pretty good year, at least with oil. So I think it makes sense to take a look at the secondary cap. And, you know, we do know that with education, obviously there'll be shortfalls down the road. So trying to kind of think out of the box, I think Co-Chair Harshman came up with some pretty good ideas, and no one wanted to mess with any of the percentages that go out right now with severance. I think that made total sense. I thought the same thing today or yesterday when I drove up, that we definitely need to keep the amount of money in our highways that we have now, if not more. So I thought this made a lot of sense. And like I said, the only thing that made me a little nervous, obviously, with when you do these caps is the volatility in the markets with our oil and gas and obviously coal and so on and so forth. So, but at least this is, I think, a step in the right direction, and particularly since this is produced off of school lands, it makes a lot of sense, I think, to move it into the school foundation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Schuler. Katie, let's go to the online. Representative Henderson.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to underscore the comment about, not charging up that hill. The word stability comes to mind, and also inflation. We have some real world conditions that we need to take account of. And so you ask yourself the question, what's broken here that we need to fix? And I think where we're at now, based on what we heard in the discussions in the working group and from other information we received, where we're at is probably a good place to stay for the time being, particularly looking at what we got coming into the state in terms of other potential funding. So I would advise the committee to hold what we've got and keep our eyes open. Thank you.
Do we have anything else online or elsewhere? Any comments to Representative Henderson, Mr. Co-Chairman? Okay. Representative Sweeney, so good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in the thought process and working through this on the cap, is there any projections on the 2/3, 1/3, then moving to the secondary cap? if we increased it to 200 million from the 155, what that might look like back to the good co-chairman.
Mr. Good, co-chairman.
Mr. Chairman, so above the cap on severance is in statute is currently a split between general fund and budget reserve. So it's all general fund budget. And we've instituted, in increments in the budget the last 4, 6 years or so that we tried this idea of a secondary cap. And that's in the current budget. That'll expire next July. The problem with secondary caps, you just don't know. You're looking for stability, which the previous speaker talked about, and that has very little to no stability. And I think changing those is a hard sell to the legislature, changing those flows. And we were able to do it really off of the Craig estimates. And if anything came in above the Craig estimate, we did this secondary cap flip kind of thing, we call it. Last several years, and we'll see if JC and the legislature wants to do that again, when we go into this next budget session. But it's just a stability piece really that wouldn't affect bonding or anything else, would be to raise that. This is what we talked about in our working group, raise that severance from 155 to 200 and redo the percentages so nobody loses a dollar, but that new 45 million that would be under the cap would go to school foundation. So who does that affect? Doesn't affect anybody under the cap, but it takes 45 million then off that 2/3, 1/3 general fund budget reserve split. So it takes 45 million from the general fund. That's really where, so there's always a loser and a winner in the thing if you're going to readjust that. So that's what that is. But the advantage to that is it changes that, because we're working on projections like every government and in the United States, local or state or federal, you're working on projections. And so it changes that to the good, certainly. And 45 million a year, what does that equal? I mean, that's a third of penny sales tax. I mean, it's a significant amount. It's over half the profile deficit in K-12. But again, that's just throwing that out there. That's probably the only one out there that we'd even probably propose. And again, I'm not charging up the hill. I don't hear the cavalry behind me on this one. And but that's the thoughts of it. And I think to not particularly mess with the FMRs is our advice.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Let me do a check. Can everybody online hear when folks are talking? Is that all right?
I hear perfect, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm actually surprised that so I'm looking at our fiscal data book. I'm surprised that in our severance tax revenue flows, we actually haven't had a permanent school foundation flow in it. So I do understand the policy decision of if we link some of the school foundation to severance tax funds, there's some volatility inherent in that, but I do think it makes sense to prioritize our school foundation over the general fund, and it does make sense, in my opinion, to put some of that of that revenue flow into the school foundation program. So I think that's ultimately the policy decision for the committee, is if we think that it makes sense to prioritize the school foundation program over that 45 million that would go into the general fund otherwise.
Go ahead.
And Mr. Co-Chair, just add to that. And I think when we came around, really, because the issue is, part of that issue is about 50 million a year in severances produced on school trust lands. And so we just get, part of this deal, you talk about fairness and everything else. And so that was part of that for the committee, for your consideration.
Anything else from the committee? I'd like to open it up to the public if we could. So is there any public comment online, Katie, or anything? Okay, there's not. Anybody in the room like to address the committee on this? You're walking the wrong way. Ms. Johnson. Anybody else like to address the committee? Anybody? Not seeing any public comment. Committee, anything further on this topic? Any directions for the staff?
Mr. Chairman, and if we want to I guess this would be a vote of committee right now, if we wanted to sponsor a bill to do that. And so I'll just throw that out there, I guess, see what the temperature of the committee is. And it'd be simply to raise that severance cap from 155 to 200, readjust the percentages so there's no losers in any dollars, and that 45 million then would be flow to the school foundation program. So that's our one option that we talked about. So I'd throw that out there for the committee's consideration for a bill draft.
Just for everybody, this is in no way a final approval of anything or a proposal. It's just to have something drafted so that we put it out for the public and we can discuss it at our next meeting. So is there a second for that proposal? Got a second from Sweeney. I've got seconds all the way down over here. Not seeing a lot of seconds down here. No, this is the tough side of the room down here. Okay, further discussion on the motion. Anybody against it? Want to weigh in? Guess not. Any further discussion? Let's put it to a vote. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. I heard one online and I heard one no here.
Aye.
Okay, are there any opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4. Anything online that's opposed? I think the motion is carried, so we will have a bill draft prepared for that. All right. It looks to me like we're at our second item on our agenda, which is revenue recovery through workforce protection. Ms. Johnson, welcome. Turn on the microphone and introduce yourself. And
Cool. We
Go.
arrived in the nick of time, I guess.
we're always efficient in the
Yeah,
revenue committee.
Efficiency is great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Tammy Johnson. I'm the Executive Director for Wyoming State AFL-CIO. It's great to see all of you. Not on the TV, although y'all look great on TV. It's awesome. With me today, I've brought Brian Almquist, our Executive Director, our Vice President, who's also the business manager for the Plumbers and Pipe Fitters Local 192 in Cheyenne. So I wanted to begin today with just a little summary of the history of where this idea came from, to kind of look at revenue streams and how we can support Wyoming workers and working families and generate more revenue for the state at the same time. Currently, many businesses in the state receive what's called a exemption for sales and use tax, manufacturing sales and use tax. And this is applied across a lot of different industries in a lot of different ways. And you can go and look at the tax code under 39 and look at the different exemptions that fall under each of those categories. I've taken a look at those statutes and I don't need to spend time itemizing those for you today, but I did want to talk about a couple and how we can look at those and either help employ more Wyoming workers or generate more revenue, both of which support a growing economy in Wyoming. And so to that end, I want to just thank you and appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. Being put on the agenda is a great honor, and I appreciate that you guys have felt like this was an important enough issue to talk about. We have 7,000 members in AFL-CIO. There's another 10,000 union members in the state that are not affiliated with Wyoming State AFL-CIO. And I know they appreciate your consideration of this topic as well. Employment in the state is a big issue. And we often hear, and I'm sure you'll hear today from others, that we don't have the workers to support the industry that's going on in the state. And it's kind of a catch-22 or a vicious cycle, because if we don't have policies in place that support workers and bring workers into the state and give workers jobs, then we can't have workers here to do the jobs that we need. Yesterday, I was speaking with someone in Cheyenne who's involved in economic development. And she said, but Tammy, we don't have the workers. We want to build, there's a construction company that wants to build 120 houses in Cheyenne. We don't have the workers. And I said, well, it's funny because if we bring workers from other states in to do that work, there's no housing for them. But if we give workers in Wyoming those jobs, then we can begin to grow the workforce. But we can't grow that workforce if we don't support the workers who are here. And all that is a long line of training, employing, and lining up contractors and construction people who want to do the job. So it is a very detailed and interlocked kind of system. But I think it begins in many ways with you guys and the policies that you craft and pass that help support Wyoming workers. So to that end, I had this great idea last year when I was thinking about some of the industry that's going on in Cheyenne. And Brian's going to share with you how many of his workers were impacted with a change in policy in Cheyenne that really laid off many workers in Cheyenne to the tune of about $4 million in annual salaries in the community because there's no protections in place for these workers. So I started thinking about that after Brian told me what happened. And I thought, isn't there a way that we can look at companies that get these tax exemptions and that money's not going into the state coffers, but they're not hiring Wyoming workers. They're bringing workers in from out of state. And folded into that too is another element of revenue that Brian's going to talk about, and that's vehicle registration that's not happening from these out-of-state workers who are coming in. So as I began to look at this, I talked to some legislators last year, and it sort of seemed like an interest to them, but I was also cautioned that LSO had some concerns that this might violate the Privileges and Immunities Act. And to that end, I went out and did a little bit of research. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to pretend to be a lawyer. But there's a landmark case in Wyoming called the State of Wyoming versus Anich, A-N-O-N-I-C-H, where the Wyoming Supreme Court found that the Preference Act, which is for public works projects, as you know, that is, and it's still in effect today, does not violate the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the US Constitution, nor does it violate the Equal Protection Clause provision of either the state or US Constitution for public works projects, which, because there's a state interest there. And the court said that there's an evil, that the balancing act between what the evil was to the state and what the good was to the state allowed the state to have a preference act because the evil of unemployed workers outweighed the harm or the burden that's put on workers who come from other states. So while the state acknowledged that workers do have a fundamental right to move across the country and work, and we all want to have that right. You know, I want to be able to move to my home state of Alaska and become a fisherman again if I could. That's not in the cards, but I should have that freedom to do that. And so the state acknowledged that, but it also acknowledged that there's an evil or a harm to the state when we have unemployed workers that can't find work. And so there's a balancing act there. And the Wyoming Supreme Court found that a preference act is okay. And of course, that only applies to public works projects. So what I'm talking to you about is our private entities that get tax exemptions. So I think, I mean, again, I'm not trying to be a lawyer here. I'm just trying to give you some guidance that in Kleinsmith v. Sertleff, which is in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, they said when a statute only has indirect effects on interstate commerce and regulates even-handedly, the court has examined whether the state's interest is legitimate and whether the burden on interstate commerce clearly exceeds the local benefits. So that case dealt with taxation. And it says that, you know, there's a balancing act there too to determine if a state is, if the local benefit is greater than the burden. So I think we have to consider that when we talk about whether Wyoming workers being excluded from work, and you're going to hear Brian's story, balances against giving a company a tax exemption when they're not participating in our economy in the way that they could. So I'm asking this committee to consider legislation modifying the tax code, section 39, under the exemptions clauses, to put some provisions in there that we have to hire Wyoming workers. Now it's already been a kind of a precedent established under the data centers. If you look at the statute for data centers, there are a number of provisions that the data centers must meet before they get the tax exemption. And one of those includes creating jobs in Wyoming that, and the Wyoming Business Council is charged with determining whether the number of jobs created is sufficient enough to support the industry. And so I talked with them yesterday, and they have a whole way of calculating that and measuring that to determine if one of these data centers is going to get a tax break. And I'm not looking at going after data centers particularly. I'm just saying that's an example of one of the industries in our state that has real specific provisions. Many, if you look at the statute, there are many provisions there that they must meet in order to receive the tax exemption. So when we talk about the privileges and immunities clause, we're not saying we're going to tax you more because you don't hire Wyoming workers. We're saying if you hire Wyoming workers, we're going to allow you to have this tax exemption. And I know that you guys agree with me. I hope that employing Wyoming workers is really important. And it's a ground we can all meet together on. I think everybody in the room would agree that we need to have our workers doing jobs here in the state. When the workers who work out of Brian's hiring hall and some of the other hiring halls in the state can't find work here, they go to other states and work. And that system is not the best system because it breaks families apart, and parents have to go work in another state. They have to be gone for long periods of time. The travel is incredible. And while that's the best we can do right now, what we would like to do is ask you to revise some of the state policies to bring those workers home and to use the growth that's coming to Wyoming in the future is incredible. We've heard about the things that are going to happen in Cheyenne with the missile silos, with the data centers that are being built. All kinds of things are happening. So let's be proactive and craft policies that would either build our state coffers or support Wyoming workers. And I think in my mind, supporting the workers is the best thing. I'm not here to ask you to take away the tax, take away the exemption. I'm here to ask you to craft policies that help these businesses that are coming to our state hire the people who live and work here.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions for Ms. Johnson, Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just to be clear, this is in general for any employee, not just union workers, correct?
Go
Mr.
ahead, Ms.
Chairman.
Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Sweeney, absolutely. I'll be the first to say I believe union workers are the best workers, and we want people who work in the state who make good wages and who, when they retire, they're covered with a pension and they have health insurance and all those good things that we want for workers. But absolutely, we want to support all workers in this state and all working families. And when it gets right down to it, let's think about the families that are impacted by this. So thank you for that question.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful softball.
And I hit it, right?
Yeah, you nailed it. Anybody else? Representative Roscoe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Johnson, do other states like Colorado have similar legislation?
Ms. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Roscoe, thank you for the question. I don't know. I mean, I would hope that as we move down this road, we could dig into that and find comparable legislation that works. So maybe that's even met the test, so we don't have to go through some kind of legal battle.
Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else? So just your point about the data centers, and I think some of our exemptions also have employment requirements in them. That's kind of an interesting twist on all this. And I thought your legal analysis, what was the name of the second case you mentioned?
Well, actually, there's two. One I
Okay.
didn't get to, Kleinsmith v. Sirtcliffe, and I'm happy to leave this with you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman. And then the other one in Exxon Corporation v. Wyoming State Board of Equalization, they looked at interstate commerce being immune from state taxation. So that's another interesting case that I found that just discusses that how state taxation fits into the immunities and privileges clause. So.
And you,
And
that's the only time you've referenced the interstate commerce clause. You relied on privilege and immunities
Mhm.
for the rest of it by and large. So maybe you get us a list of those cases, or
I'd
that'd
be
be
happy
great.
to.
All right. Oh, down here, Representative or Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having worked for numerous unions across all different industries, I've found that they don't offer any protection at all. With other employees, I've noticed that where they should be protected, they
Just
aren't.
let me interrupt for a second. We hearing Senator James online? We got it. Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Seem a little softer to me.
So I was just curious how you say that the protections are gonna be there when they may have been way back when unions first started, but nowadays they're not. They actually pose more of a financial burden on companies. For instance, out in the Trona mines, it was the union companies that laid off a bunch of people and closed projects when it was the private sector that actually kept all their employees and kept hiring, continuing all their projects. So my question to you is, how is this better than what we're currently doing? And how, I mean, it seems like you're giving preference to unions than over private sector. So
Senator James, I think her testimony was that this is not a union issue at all. The unions happen to be supporting it, but that it's not preferring unions, it's Wyoming workers. And so I'm not sure that this is the appropriate time to have a debate about unions or not, but I'd certainly let Ms. Johnson respond. Wasn't it that it's all workers, not that this isn't a union bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator James, thank you for your question. Yes, we're concerned about all Wyoming workers. And I'm happy to talk with you offline, Senator James, about those perceptions of unions and what they do and don't do.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a room for a discussion about unions in the middle of all this. So any other questions? How
Mr.
about-
Chairman, if you
Go
don't
ahead.
mind, would you allow
course I would.
Vice President Almquist to share some comments?
You bet. And it's Alquist? Am I saying that right?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Almquist.
Almquist. Thank
Yes,
you
sir.
very much. Welcome. And
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Committee members, thank you for a few minutes of your time. I just want to share on our perspective of what's going on at the Holly Frontier.
who are you with? I know you're with one of
I'm the
unions.
business manager for the plumbers and pipe fitters.
Plumbers and
Local
pipe fitters.
192.
Okay. And
And
where are
also-
they at?
We're out of, well, we have the whole jurisdiction, our jurisdiction's Wyoming, half of South Dakota, and about Panhandle in Nebraska.
So where do you hang your hat?
I hang my hat in Cheyenne.
All right. Good to hear it. Go ahead.
So back in August of last year, Holly Frontier, we got, well, a little bit prior to that, in the summer, we understood that Holly Frontier was going to shut down its oil refinery and move to biodiesel. And that was a pretty rapid, fast move. I had about 50 workers out there as pipe fitters. But there was there's about a total of 300 workers in total, a little bit more. Possibly I didn't quite get to talk to all the trades, but 300 is a conservative number that ended up getting laid off from Holly Frontier, and they brought in a contractor out of Texas. They came in, and right now, if you drove the parking lots of Holly Frontier, 90% of the vehicles that you'll see are out-of-state vehicles. Very few, I'm not saying all, but there are still some Wyoming workers on site. But we've had, I've had my members try to call and see if they can't apply and get a job with this company, and massive failure, just no callbacks. It's like they already had their group of people picked out. They didn't want to entertain talking to our qualified Wyoming workers. So that was, and these are local Wyoming workers that were out there. Families, the salaries getting put back into Wyoming. Now it's easy to say millions of dollars of salary is getting shipped back to whatever state those workers are from. The permitting process for out-of-state workers is when a worker comes into the state, they need to get what's called a temporary registration permit, a little tag that goes up in their window. It's $50 a month for up to 120 days. After that, they need to register their vehicle with Wyoming. These guys have been here since started moving in August and October, and we've actually called the Highway Patrol to ask them if they would please enforce that policy, and we just get the answer, we'll pass that on. As I drive through the parking lot, there are very, very few permits, and I see the same vehicles that have been out there for almost a year now with the same plates. So I think just enforcing that would help with a little bit of the revenue issue, but it's not really happening. And all we really want is, you know, union or not, we'd like to see the Wyoming workers in there. You know, that's just more revenue for us and more happy people. And it does help build our workforce for later projects, you know, like Tammy touched on. We have missile silos coming up. We have a possible new plant coming up. We need to start building our workforce right now in Wyoming so that we can put as many Wyoming workers to work on those projects as possible. And really, that's all I had. I appreciate your time.
Okay, questions for Mr. Almquist? First questions. Yeah. Representative Baker, and then we'll go to Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question revolves around the vehicles and their temporary use of our roads and not registering with the tag or getting a permit. How would you suggest that the state kind of maybe, I don't know if track's the right word, but maybe identify when these people are coming into the state so that they would know when that 120 days is over?
Yes, that's.
Go ahead, Mr. Almquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good question. I've thought of that myself. There are facilities, I can tell you, around Wyoming that when there's a big shutdown, which means that they'll shut down a plant and then they'll just pile a bunch of workers on it, working 7/12s, try to get it all done within 30, 45 days, and so that they can get the plant back up and running. There are facilities where the Highway Patrol is actually sitting outside the gate to those facilities. I'm not sure exactly what their procedure is, but they are pulling over vehicles, whether they're tagged. I can only assume that they're maybe a first time's a warning, but at that time, like I said, we know that they're sitting out there. They are finding people who do not have those tags. But as far as how to keep track, I don't know, maybe out-of-state workers need to come in and register somewhere, and that way it can be monitored. We would have to come up with a good solution to that.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Ms. Johnson, you want to
Thank
tag
you.
in on that?
Yeah, thank you. And Representative Baker, I just wanted to add, the statutes are already on, that statute is already on the books, and, you know, hopefully Highway Patrol has some rules to enforce it, but it's really important that, and that's a small piece of the revenue. I'm not even sure if that goes to the school foundation or not. That's a vehicle registration fee, but where it goes, I don't know. But it's small compared to what we're talking about with trying to keep workers in Wyoming in the bigger picture of, we have some policies in place, we could have more that would level the playing field for the people who live and work in Wyoming. And you guys intended that when you wrote that statute that says you got to register your vehicle and pay this fee. You're just simply thumbing their nose at us and saying, nope, we're not going to do it. And, you know, we have an opportunity, and that's what I see this as. The refinery that Brian spoke of is one that gets the sales and use tax exemption. And what they did to the workers, it's about $4.5 million in salaries just with the plumbers and pipe fitters alone, let alone the other 170, 200 workers that were just laid off out of the blue. that no longer have jobs in Cheyenne. So those are high paying jobs, and those people live and work in Cheyenne. And you know, that's one example. I can dig and find more if you want me to, but the policies that we have in the state seem to want to support the workers, but let's make them stronger and let's make them more effective so we can.
So thank you, Ms. Johnson, for answering Mr. Almquist's question and restating your case and seizing that opportunity. So Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Holly Frontier, this conversion, it started right around when the session was starting, and I found it very disturbing. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on the conversion itself, any policies you see that could have stopped this? Do you think it's part of this sort of politically correct movement away from fossil fuels? It's driven by in my opinion, a radical political ideology. Is that what's driving this? And you know, really these renewable fuel standards that they say is driving this or violate federal law. So could you elaborate a little more on the conversion itself, what it's costing Cheyenne in terms of jobs, the reasons for it, and policy responses to the conversion itself?
I'm going to interrupt. I mean, Representative Gray, this is not about that policy. This is about a proposal to apply tax exemptions to when they hire Wyoming workers. Now, and I agree, I can agree with you that there might be shenanigans or policies that we don't agree with respect to Holly Frontier's decision, but let's stick to the facts of the case about them employing Wyoming workers or not, and how that fits in. So let's not speculate on the environmental policy or the federal policy. It just
Mr. Chairman,
takes us far afield.
So, Mr. Chairman, so we're an hour ahead of time. The citizens of Wyoming are paying our salaries today, and I can't answer a question I've had for 7 months.
You can take
about
that
this.
question to Holly Frontier, Representative Gray. I don't think that these guys can speculate on what Holly Frontier's motivation is for the choices they're making.
I asked them to talk about policy responses.
Let's talk about the employment of Wyoming workers. Is there anything in there you want to talk about with respect to Wyoming workers? I'd stay out of the policy, the national policy reasons.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
thank you, Representative Gray. I can say that I know the steel workers had about 170 employees at the plant that made close to $100,000 a year each. So do the math. That's a lot of salaries that aren't being paid in Cheyenne now. It's a downsize. You know, we know these things happen in business, but let's keep the people who are working there, people from Wyoming.
Mr. Almquist, did you want to say anything?
I'm right there with Tammy. Let's just keep the Wyoming workers working.
Okay. Any other questions? Representative Sweeney.
Doc had,
We'll get to Doc next.
okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let's go back to the exemption. In that thought process, what do you, we've got plenty of exemptions on the books. And how are you thinking that would work? Would that go against wages? Would that, I'm not quite understanding the exemption piece.
Okay, back to you, Ms. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Representative Sweeney, thank you for the question. I think it would work kind of how it currently works, that businesses qualify in a certain manner for an exemption. For example, with the data centers, like I said, I don't have the statute in front of me. I don't think I do. There's a list of, I'm going to say about 8 provisions that company must meet in order to receive the exemption. And this is just on the use exemption. So I didn't detail the sales tax exemption. There's also a sales tax exemption that companies qualify for. Interestingly enough, the data centers have much more detailed provisions than the other exemptions for other kinds of industries. It's not as detailed and there aren't really requirements. It's just if a company does business in Wyoming, they qualify for this exemption under these sorts of conditions or this type of business. So It's interesting that the data centers have very specific provisions, whereas the other industries don't have as specific provisions. So I think there's a way to tweak that statute. Even, it's interesting, even the one that says that the data center must hire, must create Wyoming jobs. And it outlines the kind of the calculus for the Wyoming jobs. Not specifically, but it says that the Wyoming Business Council has to come up with a calculus to figure out what that ratio would be. It doesn't say Wyoming workers, it just says Wyoming jobs. And we ran into this earlier, and I had quite a showdown, as you guys can imagine, with the governor's office over the energy rebound program, because the Wyoming Business Council was in charge of implementing that program, and they had real specific requirements when you applied for the grant, and that was COVID money. So that was money specifically for the state of Wyoming. And this also kind of got me interested in this topic. But those, so the criteria that the Wyoming Business Council came up with in that grant application was that they had to create Wyoming jobs. And I said, how are you defining Wyoming jobs? Well, we let the employer define that. So that was, you could have a company from Oklahoma say, well, you know, yeah, we have Wyoming workers there. They're working in Wyoming. Didn't matter if they came from Oklahoma or not. And that really got me, because that was CARES money. Oklahoma got their own CARES money. We got ours. And it was specifically to boost employment in Wyoming. But whether or not those workers were from Wyoming, we don't know, because that data wasn't collected. And I tried to get it, and they just simply said we didn't collect that data. But I have a hard time believing 5,000 workers flooded the state in a month and a half, and they were all from Wyoming. So it made me, that got my attention, made me start thinking about this in a broader perspective. And so after that, the second round of the Energy Rebound Program, they put a residency requirement on that. And that was great, because then we know that that money is going to Wyoming residents. So those are the kinds of things I'm watchdogging, and I'm bringing to you to ask you to maybe let's look at some of these policies and say, how can we and do our best by Wyoming workers? And then where we can't, we can't. I get it. If we can't bring all those workers in and we can't hire all the workers we can, but we can say first hire, go to local hiring halls. I don't think many people even know that those are through the unions, but they keep a list of people who are looking for work. And you can go, employers can go there and say, hey, we'll sign a project labor agreement. We'll be signatory with you. But we need these workers. And you know, union workers are Wyoming residents too, and they deserve to have jobs as well. So, you know, I think if we craft policies that help them get jobs instead of bar the door, then, and nobody's doing that intentionally. It just seems like there's ways that companies can get around it. Sorry, I go on.
Kinda. Representative Sweeney, you had a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr.
We're gonna
Chairman.
get
Just
to
a quick follow-up on your on the use of the CARES Act money. I can assure you there were a number on especially plugging wells, a number of Casper folks got put back to work. So on a temporary basis, unfortunately.
Great news.
Thank you, Representative Sweeney. Doc Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is this only going to have impact when somebody is replacing workers that are coming from out or are leaving when they're going broke or whatever would happen in that outfit that you're talking about? This isn't going to apply to all employers have an exemption for their state employees.
Ms. Johnson?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hallinan, my vision is that any company that receives the sales and use tax exemption, and you're free to look at the other exemptions as well, we would say, hey, hire Wyoming people first.
Okay, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that particular, that's the big construction one, is the construction, probably the biggest sales tax, millions a year. And that's great. But look, just the question then, what is the percentage or what is the amount is really, I think, will be part of that policy issue. I think when you talk about state construction projects, now that we've had for a number of years, you know, percentages on the number of Wyoming workers, subcontractors, all those kind of things. So any thoughts on that kind of number? Because we're gonna have to have a number at some point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Hirschman, we do need a number, and I was in conversation with Director Noble in the past, and we were kind of crafting some of that stuff, but I don't have those numbers yet. And I am not expecting some kind of glorious legislation to come out of this today, but I want to have this conversation, and I think those numbers are important. And to be fair, those companies do pay other taxes. And I'm not saying that they're getting off scot-free and they're great to have in our state. But here's an opportunity. If we're going to give this exemption, then man, I'm pleading with you, let's just get these workers back to work. And Brian has a lot of guys on his rolls that aren't working now because of that shutdown at Holly Refinery. And it's not the shutdown, it's the hiring practices.
Okay.
So I would love to either have you guys request, or if I can work with the Department of Revenue to figure out what those numbers are.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Johnson, so I'm trying to think of, because this is a sales tax exemption, how we would structure this. For example, for the data center one, if you tell Microsoft that they wouldn't be able to have that exemption unless they hired only Wyoming workers, would that apply to all of Microsoft? How do you narrowly constrict it so it's only the project that they're working on? And I think I'd also be interested in what your definition of a Wyoming worker would be.
So, and Representative Yen, if you don't mind, I'll tag on slightly. It's so they'd only be paying sales tax on stuff they bought, you know, and so the only time that it's a major factor for a company is when they're doing a retooling or a construction, or, you know, that's when it matters to them. It probably doesn't matter to get the sales tax exemption for de minimis things. So I'll just see if that plants any seeds and put it back to Ms. Johnson to answer the question.
Chairman Case, Representative Yin, thank you. You're right in a sense. There's also a use tax. So that's another kind of tax on things that are, you know, for example, software, things like that at a data center. But and there are two phases. There are employees that work full time, for example, at the data center or at the refinery, and then there are employees that work on construction phase. Currently, the company that's doing the electrical work for the data center, and they're expanding. About 200 electricians are coming from Colorado. I learned yesterday that they can't find enough electricians. That company can't, so they're bringing people from back east. And so to build our workforce, we need to be in that game, and we need to have some incentive. Obviously, we can't say, Microsoft, you've got to hire 100% of your workers have to be Wyoming workers or you're out, but we can figure out some boundaries, a percentage, a bona fide attempt, you know, documented, you know, attempts to get Wyoming workers. They've gone to local hiring halls, they've gone to workforce services, they've gone to employment centers, and LCCC is training up young people to be working at these data centers. $80,000 starting salary. Those are great. Those are the kinds of jobs we need in the state. And that's a booming industry for us. So let's take a look at it now and craft our policies to make sure that those kids who are going to LCCC, they're getting the Hathaway, we're helping them get through college. Let's make sure they have jobs when they end. And I just, if I could add, I just want to say how proud I am. My daughter went out of state for school and came back, and she just got a great job in Cheyenne, and she is here back in Wyoming where she wants to be. And it was hard for her to find a job here. And she's, you know, as a parent, I know what that feels like to have your kiddos come back. And we have an opportunity here to make that real for a lot of families. She's not in a union industry.
Oh, well, you must be so.
But I can make it happen.
Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. Yeah, I was interested too when I was reading through exemptions about the data centers, that we leave that up to the Wyoming Business Council to make that determination with how many jobs, you know, that they need to have. So I'm wondering, would it be something that we would want to look at, like a percentage of the jobs need to be Wyoming jobs? Or have you thought about that in terms of the fix for this? Thank you.
Ms. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Schuler, thank you for the question. I might kick this over to Brian because he's worked with other states. I know Colorado has an 80% preference that they require. I don't know, Brian, if you might be more familiar with other states?
Let's be careful of the Colorado, the 80% preferences with respect to a tax exemption or?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Public Works project.
Public Works projects. Thank you, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
Mr. Almquist.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I am not familiar with any other states and percentage wise, but 80, like Tammy said again, 80% would probably be a pretty good number.
Anybody else? Anybody else?
Mr. Chairman, if I may add,
Oh, I don't know. Go ahead.
we're an hour ahead of schedule.
That's what Representative Gray said.
And I have waited
And
4
we're not
months.
an hour ahead anymore.
I have waited 4 months for this
Okay,
conversation.
go ahead.
Senator Schuler, I think it's important to know that while we don't have the workforce here, crafting those limits or those expectations carefully is really important because while it may be true that companies can't find those workers here, we want to really make this a soft landing so we begin to expand that pool. And we do that by saying, yeah, you have to try to hire Wyoming workers first. And here's how you try.
Anybody else? Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Johnson, so yeah, I'm really trying to work this in my head. So we do have the Wyoming Preference Act. It's for public works projects to preference Wyoming workers. And that's been seen as constitutional. I'm curious if it would make sense for the data center exemptions. So for construction projects that are using the data center exemptions, if contracts relating to constructions, if we could apply the Wyoming Preference Act to them, would that be a satisfactory type of bill that would fulfill what you're trying to go for, where we preference Wyoming workers? I'm not sure if you've seen the Wyoming Preference Act, but essentially it's preferencing Wyoming workers first for public works projects in particular. But if we want to apply this specific to construction projects, I think that would be an easy way to do it. And your thoughts? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Ms. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Yin, I did contemplate that a little, and I felt like looking at the tax exemption statutes was cleaner. But it might be that I would love the Preference Act to say all workers, skilled and unskilled, soft industry, hard industry, everything. We prefer to hire Wyoming workers. Now, that's long way, and that might go into that constitutional issue that LSO has concerns about. So I don't want to close people out from getting jobs, but we have a lot of work to do here. And I appreciate you guys hearing us. I know time is ticking, but it's a big issue. And I think there's lots we can do to help the people who live and work here and whose families go to, live here.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Anybody else? Representative Yen's got a follow-up. And we're going to go down here to Representative
Yeah,
Baker.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think just to clarify what I'm trying to contemplate here is to link the tax exemptions to the Preference Act and use the Preference Act as this framework essentially for how we preference Wyoming workers, because it's something that we already have in statute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Fair enough. Thank you. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just briefly, you had talked about this registration and the issue associated with it. I don't think that's a small issue. I think that's kind of like a graffiti thing in New York, where if you address the graffiti, you affect other things, because the cost of doing business, for these companies is reduced when they're not paying these registration fees on their vehicles. Our YDOT, we discussed it briefly already. Their budget's, over $700 million a year, 1.5 biannual end budget. I think that's a huge impact. So I'm wondering two things. One, would you be willing to explore maybe how we could go about, not necessarily an enforcement, but maybe an educational campaign to where we could try to get some of these companies to maybe buy in a little bit more? And then secondly, were there other areas that you discovered in your discussions that maybe companies might be just skirting the current statute, where we don't need to necessarily add new statute, but maybe we can do some, this public campaign where we're just trying to make these companies aware of the statute. Because, some of these companies may be aware, some of them may not be aware that they're supposed to get a tag, and it has to be renewed every 30 days. I mean, you would assume they do their due diligence, but maybe they're not aware.
Ms. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Baker, thank you for that question. Sure, education is always a good thing. And perhaps, let's assume the good intent and that these workers just don't know that they're supposed to register their vehicles. And I agree with you. I think there's a lot of money connected to it that is just being left on the table. So in any way that we can help with that, we're happy to. Always proactive and caring for, because these are workers too, and it's probably out of their pocket to buy the tag. And yeah, I think that's a great approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Follow up, Representative Baker?
Yeah, were there other areas in statute that you saw that maybe companies might just be skirting the statute, that we don't need to write new statute, but maybe look at the enforcement?
Ms. Johnson?
Chairman Case, Representative Baker, I apologize. I haven't dug that deep into the statutes, and it's hard to know private companies' practices as well as that. Be good to know, but I'm sorry, I don't.
Anybody else? Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You said this was going to be a revenue raiser potential. I just want to clarify. The only way this would be a revenue raiser is if a corporation didn't comply with the new rules on the exemption, right?
Ms. Johnson?
Chairman Case, Representative Gray, when workers work in Wyoming, there's revenue in the coffers. When they have paychecks that go to the grocery store, who pays, whatever they pay to the state, that goes to registering their vehicles here, that all those things of having a person living and working here and getting a salary, that benefits the state.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But on the face of that dollar for dollar exemption, the only way it would raise more revenue on the exemption itself would be if they didn't qualify for it, right?
Ms. Johnson?
Chairman Case, Representative Gray, the only way an exemption would raise money is if the exemption didn't exist.
Right.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Anybody else? So I might have a couple. Back to the Holly Frontier example that you mentioned, was that a contractor that was employing the workers, or was that the company itself, or do you know?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that is contractors that are hiring those people.
So I'm thinking about this in terms of the contractor is now the employer, and we have to think about how this works, and the contractor is not a Wyoming company, I assume. So there's some connections there that we kind of have to figure out. I'm sure contractors, and maybe in the refinery business, they travel all around the country and do turnarounds on refineries. I don't really know, but I'm speculating that it's kind of a narrow kind of function, and to make that contractor now employ Wyoming workers when they kind of have their own pool, I mean, it's kind of clunky. I'm not saying we couldn't do it or provide incentives, but I'm just trying to figure out how that actually works in terms of the exemption. Any ideas?
Well, in terms of the exempt, Representative Ginn was touched on it. There are contractors, and you are correct. There are groups that travel around the country and do turnaround work, but possibly following this kind of going down the same road as the Preference Act. I mean, if we do it on public works jobs, we should be able to, do it with the private contractors as well. So, I mean, yeah, I mean,
I'm listening. I'm definitely listening and open to ideas. So, and we're going to go through these exemptions today. And I think that as we go through the exemptions, some ideas will come to mind. We can say, well, this exemption kind of fits what Ms. Johnson and the plumbers and pipe fitters were talking about, Mr. Almquist was talking about. And there's a way to fix this. Some of these exemptions we may find there's kind of no connection. And I'm not trying to predict it, but I'm thinking it might be useful to keep this topic kind of open as we go through the exemptions and maybe come back and kind of be pointed about that. Is that acceptable? And would that cause you problems to stick around for the exemption discussion, both of you?
We'd love to stick around for an exemption discussion, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay. If the committee's acceptable, I might put that on the table. And then it occurs to me that there's probably some kind of a failure with respect to education. I believe it was mentioned by Representative Baker, for example. We have a contractor that's not a Wyoming company, and they come in and I'm not even sure how that works sometimes, because in some trades, plumbers and pipe fitters would be licensed. They'd have a license. You'd have to be licensed in Wyoming, correct? Would those employees be licensed in Wyoming?
Mr. Chair, it depends on where they're working. Some cities
it.
require it, some don't. Cheyenne does.
I mean, that's kind of an interesting thing. And so, like, I know for the mines, for example, my mine electrician is under the different regulations than like a licensed electrician from the state of Wyoming. So it gets very complicated. We may find that some of these employers or contractors don't even know the requirements. And yet they enjoy the exemption. They may not know that their employees need to be have their vehicles registered in Wyoming or get a temporary tag, on and on and on. And so one other way to skin the cat is to have like a Wyoming first certification program for them for an employer to go through and check the boxes that they are aware of these things and they do these things. But it's just another avenue out there that might be easier than rebuilding all the exemptions. But anyway, I leave it out there. I'm sure there are other people that want to talk on this subject in the audience, so we'll definitely hear from them. There may be some online. Were there any online questions for this panel? I'm seeing shaking heads. Okay. So anybody else from the committee? I think you're off the hook for now, but stay close. And thanks for saying you'll stick around.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Who else would like to address the committee on this topic? Who else would like to address the committee on this topic? Committee? I think it'd be great if we heard from the Department of Revenue, and I think that's a good suggestion. Ms. Arnold, did you want to address the committee on this topic? Can you think of any way that there's a connection? We might put you on the spot and ask you anyway. It's whether we can qualify exemptions based on this employment aspect. So you're here and I think it'd be good. I'm sorry. This is your first appearance and it's spontaneous, so good. But you've been here before. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brenda Henson, Director of the Department of Revenue, and I have with me today Terry Lucero.
I apologize for calling you Ms. Arnold. I'm very sorry.
It's not the first person that says.
I'm sure it's not, but I do apologize. Thank you. And thank you to my co-chairman for correcting me.
Mr. Chairman, I usually introduce myself as previously known as Brenda Arnold, so that would have made it clear. Members of the committee, Mr. Chairman, appreciate this opportunity. There have been a lot of things brought up during the last discussion, and I think you're right. Perhaps as Ms. Lucero goes through the sales and use tax exemptions, we could talk about some of the qualifying criteria. There obviously, whatever's put in statute, the Department of Revenue would administer. And currently, most of the exemptions for sales and use tax, there's not an application process per se. You read the exemptions, you determine if you qualify, and then if you qualify for exemption, you don't collect the tax and you don't pay it. And so, those are certainly administrative functions that we would have to check into. Is it possible that we would have an application process very similar to exemption applications that we have for property tax, for instance? certainly we could put something in like that. I'm really intrigued by Chairman Case's concept of maybe just more of a front end certification. Because even if we put some sort of a criteria in place for sales and use tax exemptions, how do we verify that? How do we monitor that? If they state X percent of our employees are Wyoming residents, how do we verify that? And in turn, we also know that there's turnover in the workforce. And so how do we keep track of that? So there are some questions that come to mind, but also Department of Revenue has the ability to promulgate rules. So it's possible that through that vetting process that we could put something in place. So certainly, I think it warrants more discussion. And obviously, hopefully I'll have an opportunity to meet with the representative Tamara. I apologize, I don't remember her last, Johnson, Ms. Johnson, and have some. I apologize. But, you know, definitely if it's the will of this committee, we'll look into it further.
Sounds like a good answer. Representative Jennings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Director. Could you just touch on or expound a little bit more? I mean, I get where we can reach in on public projects. We're spending public dollars. And I understand that we're now attempting to reach over on the exemption because we're exempting public dollars. But it sounds like that LSO has pointed out that there's some constitutionality here, that we're now going to use that exemption to reach over into private companies that are choosing to run their businesses the way they choose to. So could you expound a little bit more on that constitutionality or the or what's been the history there of maybe government keeping their hands out of private a little more? Could you go there a little bit?
Thank you, Representative Jennings. Ms. Hanson, if you can.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Jennings, you know, I don't know a great deal about case law. I believe LSO probably has more information on that. As far as challenges coming into play on exemptions, I think we see those. We currently have litigation at the Supreme Court that is questioning the 3-year residency requirement for a veterans exemption and its constitutional basis. So, you know, we're watching that case. But I do believe that there is a fine line there as to the purpose of government and what our intentions are. But definitely, I would probably defer to LSO. They probably have more information.
Thank you, Ms. Arnold. Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Hanson, so how do you see this working from T to green? I mean, you were talking from 30,000 feet up and this is the bill draft meeting. I guess we're in the first stage of the process, but how would you view this working T to green? I mean, we're really sort of a little too conceptual, I think, in the first 40 minutes. I mean, we got to get more in the bones here. So how would this look in the agency perspective from T to green, and how do we prevent this from increasing number of employee, you know, the costs of the agency? So how do we keep that the agency whole, you know, not increase the cost of government and also make this work?
Ms. Arnold, Ms. Henson.
Mr. Chairman Case, Representative Gray. Obviously, numerous questions came to mind in listening to the discussion this morning. First and foremost was, are we talking about one of the sales and use tax exemptions, or are we talking about numerous sales and use tax exemptions having this benchmark criteria? So we'd have to look at that. We currently, as I stated, don't have an application process, but we could certainly put one in place. But I think the amount of administration as far as tracking and application and what's the ability, let's say the Department of Revenue denies and states that, they don't qualify, then, where does that taxpayer appeal to? So those types of issues. But I think if we could at least identify which exemptions we're talking about, then I could answer that question clearer. But at this point, it's pretty vague, and I don't feel comfortable giving you a in the weeds number of what it would cost to administer.
Anybody else? Ms. Henson, are you familiar with the data center language that Ms. Johnson was talking about?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not that familiar with it. I know it talks about a goal. I think it's probably kind of fluffy and not very specific, but can you help me with that?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, and I believe Ms. Lucero can cover that. And you also have a document within your materials that outlines all of the sales and use tax exemptions, so we could actually turn to the statute if you wish. Ms. Lucero, if you want to.
Go ahead. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Terry Lucero with the Excise Tax Division of the Department of Revenue.
And you're still there.
I am still there.
Great.
So I believe the previous speaker was talking about the data center exemption, and which is found at 3915-105A8S, I believe it is. And the part that she was discussing is number 4, and it talks about has received certification from the Wyoming Business Council that the purchaser has created or will create a number of jobs in Wyoming that is appropriate to the size and stage of the development of the data processing service center as determined by the Wyoming Business Council. I do not profess to know how they do that, but I do know that when we receive information, because we're required to survey these people in this industry, when we receive information, they are supposed to provide their Wyoming Business Council certification. But it is only that they've created a number of jobs, not necessarily for Wyoming employees, is the way I understand that language.
Exactly. And thank you very much for helping with that language. So for example, in that one, you could actually change that language and say permanent Wyoming employees or something like that. It's something that you could change and tweak, and it'd be very specific. And then the business council's obligation would be to certify that they are Wyoming jobs or a certain percentage of Wyoming jobs. So we can see that that one actually doesn't accomplish our purpose, but it might be kind of a goal if we were to go down that path. Thank you very much. Anything else for the Department of Revenue? I think what we ought to do, you're going to be right up afterwards unless anybody else wants to jump in, but we'll see if there's any other questions or testimony from anybody. We might let our staff weigh in a little bit and then we'll take a break. Okay. So get ready for the big show that you're here for. Thank you very much. Committee, Josh, I don't mean to really put you on the spot, but why not? You got this, you brought this fine brain to Casper. Let's use it. So there's consistently, I've heard with respect to this notion that it would be difficult to make it constitutional, but Ms. Johnson was talking about a couple of some case law, and I know you haven't really done the analysis, but what's your speculation about this whole area?
Sure, Mr. Chairman, and I hesitate to get too deep into it without, I think we didn't know, I guess, the full request or what this bill is going to look like. And I think we need to wait until that. That said, I do think there's potential issues with interstate commerce clause, and there's certainly, gray area in there. And so it would, I think, depend on how it's crafted. I would note, I know I've looked at some of the preference law cases, and as Representative Jennings said, there's some difference there with the courts have recognized the state has a large interest in how they spend their own money. And so you can spend your money and you can say, hey, we want a certain number of state workers on this project. that same interest isn't necessarily there when the state is the regulator and saying, here's the rules that apply to private business. And so it's not quite the same level of interest that the state has. So that's the only thing I'd want to mention. I'd have to look more deeply into the case law and see how it would comport with this specific request when we have a little more detail on it.
So thank you very much. Questions for Mr. Anderson? And you will be able to maybe get references to those cases that Ms. Johnson mentioned. Representative Jennings, were you? I don't see you. There you
Sure,
go, sir.
Mr. Chairman. So
Go ahead.
actually, I was just gonna go on to that. Would you provide us with some look at that? Because in my mind, it seems like a fairly large jump across here. And this chasm of reaching into private industries and telling them, now I get that maybe the exemption is a question that we get to grapple with, but the constitutionality of reaching into a company and telling them you're going to have this or that seems to me like a fairly large jump.
Thank you. You can
Provide
comment
some
if you
more of
wish. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Mr. Chairman. Like I said, I'll definitely look into that case law, but I have noticed in those cases that, the state or the courts are much more willing to recognize that interest when the state's an actor in the commerce rather than the regulator.
Fair enough. Dr. Halloran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question for you is, I think the idea that Chairman Case brought up about certification of these out-of-state workers coming into our state and having a checklist to sign off on these various things like that tag that we now require them to have, but have really limited ability to extract those funds out of them. So is that constitutional, do you believe?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, again, I'll have to look into a little more when we flesh this out a little bit. I'll definitely provide that detail back to the committee as soon as we kind of flesh this idea out and see what it looks like. But I mean, there's certainly, some potential issue there. But there's also, like I said, there's a lot of gray area, and states have obviously tried to kind of, protect their own interests against outside influences. And so I have to look into that, Mr. Chairman.
And Josh, it occurs to me, or Mr. Anderson, it occurs to me that maybe working with the Department of Revenue, we could find out more if any other state has gone down this route. I can't believe it. That we'd be inventing it de novo. So maybe we could look into that. That'd be great. Anybody else at this time? Representative Yen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Anderson, I don't know if you happen to know this offhand. Do you know how the Wyoming Preference Act works in certifying that contractors are contracting with Wyoming laborers?
Go ahead, Mr. Anderson, if you can.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, I'm afraid I do not know a lot of the details about that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Anybody else? Thanks, Mr. Anderson. We'll probably know more by the time we get through the exemption discussion if we kind of keep this open. I appreciate your willingness to speak off the cuff. Anything else at this time? Propose we take I want to make sure I'm not cutting anybody off in the audience. Yes, Representative Gray.
I just would say for Representative Yin, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There were some changes to the Wyoming Preference Act in the last session, I'm sure that, and so they were actually pretty big, and those went through minerals. So it was kind of interesting discussion. So that was in the 2021 session.
Okay, was that a successful piece of legislation? Yes. You want to give the gist of it? Do you remember?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It had to do with the number of days. It was a reduction. I actually voted against it. And then there were changes to the way it interacted with the department, because it was a really interesting discussion. It was from the speaker brought it, and there was a feeling that there were some problems with the original drafting. So
the Preference Act whole area has been kind of a struggle to get to work and get policies that are meaningful. It definitely has been more challenging than I ever thought. So All right, well, let's take a 15-minute break. We'll come back at 20 minutes after 10, and we'll start with the most exciting topic of the day, which will probably go a lot longer than you think. It'll be the exemptions. And if we got rid of all the exemptions, we wouldn't have to worry about in-state or out-of-state. will call it back to order. And the next item for our discussion is a review of tax exemptions. So we've got kind of a blend of different topics under the sales and use tax exemptions. And we're going to kind of handle them all at once and then take public comment at the end and see if there are policy connections between them as we go forward. So I think the overall big picture is, are these exemptions necessary? Could we improve our revenue situation by getting rid of them? And what is their purpose? So with that, we'll let Ms. Henson lead us on. And it may be kind of step forward and step back as we pick different things up, and you'll just have to bear with us. My hope is that we would talk about property tax exemptions tomorrow during the property tax discussion, and that this would mostly be sales and use taxes, but there may be some connections that we have to connect. So Ms. Henson, I give it to you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, appreciate this opportunity. Really consider this an opportunity for us to answer your questions. We've provided information and documentation to you today, really to give you an overview of current statutes. We're going to cover, Ms. Lucero will cover which exemptions have sunsets, which exemptions we actually have an idea of the revenue that it's costing the state. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Lucero.
Ms. Lucero, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I've put together just a little bit of information, but I did provide a list of the current sales tax exemptions. There are currently 53 sales and use tax exemptions. Of those sales and use tax exemptions, 2 of them currently have sunset dates. The
2 out of 53.
Yes, the manufacturing machinery exemption is currently due to sunset as of December 31, 2027, if there is no further legislative action. The broadband exemption for underserved areas has a sunset date of July 1, 2024, if there is no further legislative action. The exemption for railroad rolling stock repair and assembly most recently sunset July 1, 2021. So just this summer. That exemption had been on and then sunset and came back on and sunset again. And I think that's happened I know at least twice, could be more than that. Of course, there has been other exemptions that we've had that have had sunset dates. The exemption for equipment used to generate electricity from renewable resources sunset in 2012. The Department of Revenue, the Wyoming Business Council, and the Department of Workforce Services is required to report on some of the economic incentive exemptions that we have. And we do that once a year. We provide a report for the manufacturing machinery exemption, the repair or assembly of railroad rolling stock, the coal gasification or liquefaction exemption, the data processing service center exemption, as well as now the broadband internet service for underserved areas exemption. So we do that by requesting information from those in the industry that take advantage of these exemptions, and we request information on the amount of purchases they've made claiming these exemptions. So for fiscal year 21, we have just closed this project and started the report for the legislative committee that receives it. So for the year 2021, I can give you an estimate of what that exemption cost has been for those exemptions that we report on. The manufacturing machinery is estimated at $6.6 million in unrealized sales tax.
6.1.
6.6. Excuse me, I did misspeak. Yes.
Yeah.
The railroad rolling stock repair and assembly was $345,000. I was told that, and these are only, you need to understand that these responses only include those that responded to our survey, because we don't get 100% response. The broadband exemption is 602,000. And the data center exemption was 13.9 million. And those are sales tax dollars, not purchase dollars. And with that, I'm happy to any
And the coal gasification, nothing happened.
is zero. I don't believe we have ever had anything
Okay.
listed under that.
Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've always been a written learner. Is this somewhere in the materials or, because we have all the exemptions, but those four on the, where is that in the materials?
Do you have it in the materials?
Those figures?
Yeah.
No, those
Okay.
figures are not. They're just.
Okay.
So those 5 exemptions are kind of special because we actually have a reporting requirement. And it might be good to have a summary table for all that. We could probably get that later, but
And you do get that report
We do.
typically at your those reports typically at the November meeting, I believe.
and I think you author some of those reports.
I help.
Yeah.
I have a great staff that actually does that.
Okay, Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious if you happen to know off the top of your head, even though they may be exemptions, they still have the potential to bring in a lot of revenue, more than what they exempt and create jobs. Do you happen to know of how many of those actually do that? And also the ones that were just sunset, do any of those do that? And do you happen to know the numbers?
Sarah.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, I do not know that. We do provide through Department of Economic Analysis, I believe, a REMI model with these reports. And they kind of go through the other taxes that those companies are required to pay, as well as the number of jobs that they create. But I did not bring that information with me today. We don't have it from them for this fiscal year.
And the REMI model is just run for those 5 proposals, right?
That is correct.
We don't
Mr.
run
Chair.
the REMI model to say what is the food tax exemption achieve in the economy one way or the other, for example. It's just the 5 that we require reports on. And I just might add from that it's a good tool. We didn't used to even run the REMI model on these exemptions, and some of the newer ones we started requiring that. And you can learn how much a tax exemption costs in terms of taxes lost per job. And that can be quite an astounding figure when you actually do the math. Thank you. Keep going if you can. Anybody else? Keep going.
That's all the information I had to present to you on the exemptions. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Lucero. So really, I mean, out of those, the 53 exemptions we have on the books, and always, there used to be legislators would bring a bill every year to remove them all, and we'd usually end up adding 1 or 2, and so that kind of ended. But really, then you don't have information. I mean, I've seen LSO estimates, and I think it must be comparisons to like South Dakota and do a population estimate, newspapers, farm implements. Those are some of the bigger ones. Membership organizations, and food is the biggest one, certainly. I mean, are there updated estimates on all these? I mean, I don't know if we need to know about school annuals, but I mean, some of the bigger ones that are out there, do you have that somewhere you can provide us? Not at this moment, but down the road in a few weeks, really what those numbers look like.
Ms.
I know,
Lucero.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I do know that a number of years ago, the department did something, and I don't know if that was working with LSO or not, to give some kind of estimation on what exemptions cost. I don't believe that's been updated in several years, but I can try to track that down and see if there's some history there that I could work off of to look at that and update those figures.
Okay, thank you. And I think, some of the just memory stuff, I mean, food, it seems like is around 60 million a year. Seems like farm implements is 9-10 million a year, those kind of things. And we really just never see that because they're not reported at all. So, okay, so thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Arnold.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Harshman, one thing on the farm implements, when that exemption passed years ago, one of the discussions revolved around property taxation. So even though they get an exemption on the front side of, on the farm implements, they do report those new acquisitions under personal property for property tax. Now, within the computer assisted mass appraisal system, since we have access to the details in all 23 counties at the Department of Revenue, we could run a query and get you an idea of just an aggregate total of investment, 2021, 2020, 2019. We'd be happy to provide that to the committee the next meeting.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, and I think as you look at those 53, the 48 that we don't know, and I mean, as you look at them, and maybe just with your years of expertise in this area, certainly more than all of ours combined, maybe just look and say, geez, these that we know are probably the bigger ones. I mean, it's not school annuals probably, so don't waste your time. I mean, but kind of maybe you pick out the top 5 or top 10 or the ones you think, well, this is probably over $1 million an exemption each year, and maybe bring that to the committee's attention just for our education.
And Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Henson,
Sorry,
just
Coach.
one second. So you bet, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think if we actually go through the exemptions in a little bit more detail, and today, I think you're going to see some are big. These will begin to strike us all, which are big or which are. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Ms. Henson.
Chairman Case, Co-Chairman, I think as we go through them, you'll also see those exemptions that are on the books that are more of just the workflow. So for example, the exemption where if I am a vendor and I'm buying goods for my business, I transform those goods and then I sell a product and then the end purchaser is my customer, but I don't pay a sales tax on those goods. So there's a mechanics here, there's governmental exemptions. So I think it will be fairly easy to go through. When we talk about the property tax exemptions tomorrow, historically, we've kind of gone through and divided them up into categories. Are they governmental? Are they society? Are they economic incentives? We'll be able to do that with this list of sales and use tax exemptions as well. So however you'd like to proceed, Mr. Chairman, on these exemptions, we can go page by page or
Pardon me, my mic wasn't on. We have the time. We talk about exemptions. We talk the big game. We might as well see what they are. It just doesn't get any more exciting than this. So go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee. So the sales and use tax exemptions are found at Wyoming Statute 3915-105. So the first set of exemptions are for the purpose of exempting sale and services of tangible personal property, which are protected by the United States Constitution and the Wyoming Constitution. So it's basically just those things that Wyoming's prohibited from taxing under the laws or Constitution of the United States or Wyoming.
Do you have any idea what that might be?
There's
A
probably.
religious exemption, I would imagine.
No, that's listed further.
Okay.
And so I believe this is more like, goes on to the interstate commerce exemptions for the trucks, truck tractors, semi-trailers, those kinds of things, so that it doesn't interrupt interstate commerce.
Okay.
Those kinds of things. So you also have the leases of the motor vehicles with or without trailers that are computed from the gross receipts of the operation. So this is your contract.
So you're just to let me be clear, you're under little a, the Romanet 2, right?
Yes, correct.
So that's not the ones about the Constitution. But it is interesting, but please continue. I'm not sure what exemptions come about directly from the Constitution.
Right off the top of my head, I guess I can't
can't
think
either.
of it.
But there must be something. Anyway, go ahead with your discussion of
So then the
Romanet 2.
next one exempts sales to the joint appropriations and training programs approved by the United States of Labor. And then the other one is the exemption for the sale of food purchased with supplemental nutrition assistance benefits.
Is that food stamps?
Yes.
Okay.
The next one is the sale of,
Yeah, food stamps is E.
that is correct. Then the next set of exemptions are exemptions for items consumed in production.
Right. And in economics, we kind of think about this as being the intermediate products. These products are going to be eventually taxed, so you don't tax all the components that go into the product. In some countries, they do. It's more of a value added tax. The amount of value that goes increases, you do it. But what we do with the sales tax is tax the total value at the end of the production. So all the intermediate suppliers don't get taxed. And that makes sense, actually, I think. But Ms. Lucero, I didn't mean to steal your thunder.
Oh, you're fine. So the first exemption is for the purchases of tangible personal property for people engaged in manufacturing, processing, or compounding, when those items become an ingredient or component of that manufactured, processed, or compounded product. So exactly what you were just speaking of, Mr. Chairman. The next exemption under that subcategory is the sale of livestock. So we don't tax the sale of livestock in Wyoming. Feeds for use in feeding livestock or poultry that's kept for marketing purposes. Seeds, roots, bulbs, and small plants and fertilizer that's planted to the land.
So can we stop for just a second on this? I understand that part B where it says sales of livestock, feeds. But the first one is sales of livestock. I guess that's because the grocery store is going to put the tax on it at the end, except for the grocery store doesn't. So not anymore. Anyway, that's interesting the way that's written. I can understand the feed that goes into the livestock and all of that, but I haven't looked at these in a long time and I appreciate it. Anyway, please continue. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. The next one in that subparagraph is intrastate transportation by public utility or others of raw farm products to processing or manufacturing plants. Then it moves on to the sale of power or fuel to the people engaged in manufacturing, processing, or agriculture. When that power or fuel is consumed directly in those activities.
So I'm sorry about this. This is being an economist that drives me crazy. So the sale of power or fuel to a welding shop that fabricates trailers, for example, would be taxed, but the sale of power or fuel to an agricultural deal is not taxed. Would that be right?
Well, if they're manufacturing the trailer and they qualify as a manufacturer, they would get the power or fuel, at
Okay.
least a portion of it. Now, interestingly enough, because you were talking earlier about an application process
Right.
for exemptions, this is one, and I don't know the history of why the department did it, but this is one that we actually had way back when, an application process for.
Huh.
I don't recall the details of it, but I do recall that we approved. And there was a lot of requests that came in. I don't know how detailed it was, but I just recalled that that was one that we've had the application process for.
So like power to a drugstore would be taxed, but power to a manufacturing facility that is certified to be would not be taxed.
And then the next exemption under that is for power or fuel for those engaged in transportation business when the same is consumed directly in generating motive power for actual transportation purposes, except for the fuel, gasoline or gasohol or diesel fuels that are subject to the fuel taxes that are listed there. This would be like for moving oil and gas through a pipeline. That's one example that I can think of right now. Wholesale sales, what Ms. Henson was discussing if she purchases her inventory for her business to resell to her customers. Sale of fuel used as boiler fuel in the production of electricity. And then the cost of food or meals furnished by a food establishment with or without charge to their employee for consumption on premises for your employees at your restaurant. The next subsection is exemptions of sales and services and tangible personal property sold to government, charitable nonprofit organizations, irrigation districts, weed and pest control districts. So the first one is obviously the state of Wyoming or its political subdivisions is exempt from sales tax. Sales made to religious or charitable organizations, including the meals or services to senior citizens that are certified to the Department of Revenue by the Department of Health in the conduct for their regular religious or charitable or senior citizen activity. Then we have occasional sales made by those religious or charitable organizations for fundraising purposes. That's in the conduct of their regular activities, religious or charitable activities. The next exemption is sales to a joint powers board organized under the Wyoming Joint Powers Act. Sales prices of admissions to user fees to county or municipally owned recreational facilities such as swimming pools, athletic facilities. Labor or service.
Can we stop
charges-
there for a second?
Sure.
Committee, if I'm annoying you, you just got to tell me and I'll back it off. But for example, this is, we're going to see this same thing with respect to government activities. So, I mean, you could argue that some of these facilities could be done by the private sector, and in the private sector, they would have to charge sales taxes. So, and Ms. Arnold, Ms. Henson, a few years ago, did a great presentation on government exemptions, and we're gonna hear more about that. But this is like, so if you have a private rec center, they pay taxes. You have to pay taxes. But if you have a public rec center owned by government, you don't. Ms. Henson. you gonna
And Mr. Chairman, in all of these, not all, but the majority of these exemptions, keeping in mind that it's actually the customer that is paying the tax.
Right.
And it is the vendor that is simply collecting and remitting that tax to the Department of Revenue for distribution. So again, we think about the company or the vendor, but typically it's actually the customer that's
Correct.
paying that tax. So just clarification. Thank you.
And go ahead, Mr. Cochon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our amusement recreation services, they're in these services that are not taxed. I mean, that's how I read that one. So it's an interesting discussion, thinking of a swimming pool, city of Casper, or a swimming pool at a private health club. Pay a membership to access that, but you don't pay tax on that membership because that's a recreational or amusement.
That is correct.
And you pay to go to a city of Casper pool, but you don't pay tax going in that pool. So nobody's paying for any taxes on amusement or recreation or. Is that correct? I mean, ski lift tickets aren't taxed, bowling alleys.
Mr. Co-Chairman, you're correct. That is correct. The ski lift tickets are not taxable. The lineage at a bowling alley is not. They do
So-
collect tax on like
Mr.
rental
Co-Chairman.
of stuff.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so really this
Doesn't mean anything.
subparagraph E is really also in another part of the statute, really under these amusement and recreation services
Would that be true? Is it a perfect match?
as a service that's exempt. Or is it the
Okay,
same?
so Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think there are admissions that are taxable. For instance,
Movie
if
theaters?
you buy a concert ticket or a movie theater, that's considered like an admission ticket, and those are taxable.
Hmm.
Okay, that isn't necessarily a service, though. I think you're relating the services to that spreadsheet where I discuss taxing the service itself. This is the price of admission too. So,
Gotcha.
so your
Thank you.
admissions to fairgrounds or, public, like a carnival or something like that would be taxable. Those are admission tickets.
So I think I get that, but can I ask the question, if we were to remove E from the statute, I'm not saying we're going to, but say we did, would everything fall under that other exemption or not? Does this have any real effect?
Well, this is exempting like, your
If it's owned by
municipal
government.
pools.
Yeah,
Right, so this is exempting admissions to your municipal pool, so. But if there was a public pool and they charged an admission, then
Mhm.
you would pay tax on that admission.
So I guess I get
But
confused.
there is an exemption for other admission services as well, or an imposition.
And it might not be admission per se, but it might be memberships, right? Would that be
Correct.
fair enough? Like a health club, you own a membership, you don't pay a fee every time.
That is correct.
See how
Mr.
tangled up
Chairman.
this all is?
Your admission into the
Yeah,
world.
yeah. It's all, I love this stuff. Keep going, please.
Okay, so the next one is labor or service charges, including transportation and travel for repair, alteration, or improvement of real property and tangible personal property owned by or incorporated in projects under contract with the state of Wyoming or its political subdivisions, including irrigation districts. Then there's,
So just, that's kind of a limited list. I mean, it only lists, you got the irrigation district, Whedon Pest, and state of Wyoming or any of its political subdivisions. It doesn't really apply to special districts, unless we want to tortuously think they're a political subdivision or not. And it doesn't apply to joint powers boards necessarily, except for by some extension. Are any of those limited, or we just probably apply it to everybody? I bet we do.
well, because there is no application process.
We wouldn't know. Okay, thank you. Keep going.
Sales to an irrigation district are also exempt. Sales to weed and pest control district created under another Wyoming statute are exempt. Intrastate transit of persons services by government, charitable, or nonprofit organizations. The next set of exemptions are exempting sales of services and tangible personal property, which are alternatively taxed. So the sale of a transportable home, once it's been taxed once, is not subject to tax. Gasoline or gasohol, as well as diesel and other fuels that are subject to the fuel taxes. Gratuities or tips which are offered to employees as specified under another statute are exempt, whether they're offered or separately invoiced by the seller. The next set of exemptions is exempting sales and services and tangible personal property, which are essential human goods and services. So it's the intrastate transportation by public utility or others of sick or injured or deceased persons by ambulance or hearse. The sale of the tangible personal property sold under prescription. So this includes insulin for human relief, syringes and needles, blood plasma. It's a plethora of
I'm
lists.
glad we exempt blood plasma.
Then the sale of non-capitalized equipment and disposable supplies used in the direct medical or dental care of a patient. Sales of water delivered by pipeline or truck. And sales of food for domestic home consumption. The next set of exemptions are provided primarily to business. So inter and intrastate transportation of drilling rigs, which includes the movement or conveyance of the drilling rig to or away from the well site. Persons regularly engaged in the business of making loans or supervised financial institutions when they foreclose on a loan or repossess a motor vehicle on which they filed a lien. they're not liable for tax to retitle the vehicle.
So does that mean that that's not considered a transaction? Is that kind of what that means? I
Well,
mean,
they're
not for tax purposes.
Mr. Chairman, yes, they're not considered purchasing the vehicle, they're repossessing it
Mhm.
or foreclosing on a lien that they had filed as a financial institution. So they don't have to pay the tax in order to get the vehicle back into their name, but the tax is still due by the purchaser if the tax had not been paid.
And then the first one about the transportation of drilling rigs. So if I move other things, do I pay taxes? Like, do I have to pay taxes on a house move or? I mean, if I mean, you could, if I want to move this generator, it's not a drilling rig, and the moving company, do they charge me taxes?
Mr. Chairman, no.
No? So it's interesting. We have a lot of exemptions that say that something's exempt, but it's also kind of exempt somewhere else. It makes it even more confusing to figure all this out. So we could consolidate some of these laws and yet maintain the same exemptions that we have now. So transportation services are all exempt. We would
Mr.
need a
Chairman,
special one for drilling rigs.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, not all
Okay,
transportation services like transportation of passengers, intrastate transportation of passengers is a taxable event.
okay, how about household goods within state?
That is not because it's exempted as later on as freight and transportation. So yes, it's a little confusing.
Seems like there's room for some just cleanup to make it more understandable, but you're doing great and thank you. I appreciate the committee not throwing me out the window. Keep going.
The next subparagraph includes exemptions as an economic incentive, and these are most of the ones that you've been speaking about this morning, I think. Intrastate transportation of employees to or from work when paid or contracted for by the employer or employer. Freight and property, including oil and gas by pipeline. Then the sale and service of professional
This is the
engineers,
ka-ching one.
geologists, and members of other professions. This is your drilling exemption for oil and gas. The sale of school annuals, sales of newspapers, sales of carbon dioxide and other gases used in tertiary production. The sale of lodging services provided by a person known in the trade and public as a guide or outfitter for those temporary shelters. They are exempt from the local lodging tax, but still subject to the sales tax. Then the sale of farm implements. The sale of aircraft repair or remodeling at a Federal Aviation Administration certified repair station. And that includes the repair or replacement materials and parts.
But if we have an automobile and then there would be sales tax on that repair.
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
So I think it's on the labor too.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I
Is the
didn't hear
sales tax on an automobile repair on the labor as well?
labor and materials, Mr. Chairman.
So an airplane's exempt, cars not. I mean, it's interesting.
The sale and service of transmitting radio waves to a one-way pager that's owned or rented by a service subscriber where messages are received or displayed. I don't know how much that has ever been used.
That's pretty old school stuff, but
Sales of goods or services for the purpose of raising money and charges for admission to any amusement, entertainment, recreation, game or athletic event for kindergarten through 12 public school. The next exemption is for manufacturing machinery. And it has a couple of requirements. It has to be, the sale or lease has to be to the manufacturer himself. It does not include any non-capitalized machinery unless it's expensed accordingly. And again, it's due to sunset December 31 of 2027.
So non-capitalized machinery would be something where there's a tax rule that lets you not, it'd either have a short life or there's a tax rule that provides for an exemption where it could be, and this would be a federal tax rule, that you wouldn't capitalize that piece of machinery. I think there was something about that for vehicles, for example, a few years back there. But
I don't remember. Mr. Chairman, I think this would be something like two smaller tools like drills.
Right.
Things that wouldn't be capitalized over time.
okay,
Next exemption is the sale or lease of any aircraft used in the Federal Aviation Administration commercial operation. It includes the tangible personal property permanently affixed or attached as a component part of the aircraft. The repair or replacement material parts, aircraft repair, remodeling, and maintenance services performed on the aircraft, its engine or component parts, or component materials and parts. Next exemption covers the tangible personal property and services performed for the repair, assembly, alteration, or improvement of railroad rolling stock. This is the exemption that just sunset July 1. The next exemption is for equipment used to construct a new coal gasification or liquefaction facility. Then there's the exemption for data processing and service centers, which has a lot of qualifiers. It also might be interesting to show that there is a lot of qualifiers, like before they took this, they had to provide information that they had, that these data centers had not less than $5 million in a capital investment that was located in the state. And for the second part of the exemption where they get the uninterrupted power, they had to have $50 million in a capital investment in the state. So there are those qualifiers as well for that.
what was your reference to the second? I mean, I see it. For the exemption subdivision 2 of this paragraph and 2.
Mr. Chairman, 2 exempts the sales price paid for the purchase of or rental of qualifying uninterruptible power supplies, backup power.
Where does that say
generators.
that?
That's at 3950. It's in Roman numeral 2. So it's S, Roman numeral 1 and 2 on the next page.
Okay. Oh, I see. Thank you. Who
And
was
so
that?
their purchases of these items for the computer equipment as well as for the backup power, they have to spend $2 million on purchases of that equipment before they qualify for the exemption.
So their lobbyist was on their game that day when that was coming up in committee, that's for sure. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you know of the $13.9 million of unrealized sales tax in the 2 categories 1 and 2 of the statute? Do you know how that is distributed? Does section 1 claim most of that 13.9 or?
Mr.
Saros,
Chairman,
you can.
Representative Baker, I don't have that information with me today. We do split that out in our report. They can qualify for one and not the other because their purchases for the computer equipment, they have to spend $2 million on that. If they don't meet that year, they would not be able to take that part of the exemption, but maybe they did spend over 2 million on the backup power and generators, then they would qualify for that part. And we do ask them to report those 2 separately. I just don't have that information with me today, but it is in our report when we present that.
Okay. And All right, keep going. Thank you.
Mhm.
So just before you do though, this exemption came in later and it has a lot of reporting requirements and you kind of have to go through some hoops to get it. We know a little bit more about it. We know whether what it's doing or not. That's opposed to a lot of these exemptions. You'll see that we have just no idea. So this is kind of the newer vintage, I suppose.
Mr. Chairman, if I may add.
You bet you got to add your microphone on though. Go ahead, Ms.
Mr.
Henson.
Chairman, if I may add, these are also easier to identify because we're talking about data processing.
It's
the
a building,
centers, right?
yeah.
So we've got a structure. We've got county assessors that are identifying these, putting them on the tax rolls. Then, of course, it's to the center's benefit to apply and qualify for these exemptions. So we're not talking about thousands of vendors reporting. This is a manageable industry, and so it's a little easier for the excise tax division to monitor.
Fair enough. How does it compare with the manufacturing exemption? Just speculate.
Mr. Chairman, again, we can identify those manufacturers. I would be interested to know on those manufacturing facilities if the companies are fully aware. In some instances, you may not have the companies be aware of the exemption and they may be collecting and remitting. It's just hard to tell because we don't have those types of details. But, we can, on all of our industrial properties, whether it's property tax, excise tax, they're all tracked by NAICS code. So we can get that correlation of property tax and sales and use tax by NAICS code. And perhaps that would be of interest to the committee to have those types of details.
Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the manufacturing companies that aren't aware of this, is this information given to them at any point in time by the Department of Revenue? And then also too, if they weren't utilizing these exemptions and they later discovered it, would they be able to recoup that money that they paid that they weren't supposed to?
Who wants to handle that? Mr. Lucero?
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, first of all, we do have information on our website concerning the manufacturing machinery exemption. We do also provide educational webinars and try to get the industry that we are aware of. We do have some challenges in that there is an exemption from licensing as a sales tax vendor if you strictly are a manufacturer who sells at wholesale. So they aren't licensed with us, so we have to go to other people to get that information. And so while we try, I don't know that we have 100% list of those manufacturers. If the manufacturer was not aware of the exemption, there is a 3-year statute of limitations where they could, yes, go provide their vendor that sold them the manufacturing machinery an exemption certificate, and they would be able to get the sales tax returned to them.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would that apply to anyone that qualified for an exemption and later discovered it if they did it within that 3-year time period? Does that blanket everyone?
Ms. Lucero.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, yes, it would cover anyone that was not aware of an exemption as long as they provided the exemption certificate and actually did qualify for it.
Ms. Henson.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, the other piece of that is going back to who is the taxpayer. So you've got a vendor that's collecting the sales tax. So the entity typically that would be entitled to a refund would be that customer.
Is there a minimum size on the manufacturing exemption? Anybody remember?
minimum size?
For
Mr. Chairman?
of a purchase that would be, come under the exemption.
Mr. Chairman, no. There's not.
So, and the list of what constitutes manufacturing is a pretty long list, so there definitely could be manufacturers who, because they don't sell in the retail market, they don't have a sales tax license. There definitely could be manufacturers that aren't aware of the exemption, and it could be pretty small operations, I would imagine. It's a possibility. But it'd be good if we went the other way, and then we wouldn't have to find them. Anyway, okay, please keep going.
The next exemption is the broadband exemption for underserved areas. This is new in the last couple of years, I believe. And so there's an exemption for that equipment if they were to provide internet access for underserved areas. The next set of exemptions are avoiding the application of sales tax more than once on the same item for the same taxpayer. So this is your trade-in value of tangible personal property is excluded from the sales price of new tangible personal property if it's done in one transaction. The sales price of motor vehicle that is, or house trailer, trailer coach that is to be removed from the state of Wyoming, where the purchaser declares that they're not a resident and will register it in another state.
Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if I understand this correctly, we are giving out-of-state people an exemption on their trade-ins. And we're making people within the state of Wyoming still pay sales tax on those trade-ins. Do I understand that correctly?
Go ahead if you can.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, no, the trade-in value of tangible personal property when it's traded in for new tangible personal property in the same transaction, that just reduces your sale price. The next exemption there is not related to the trade-in value. It's related to an out-of-state purchaser, non-resident of Wyoming, purchases a vehicle in Wyoming. They can provide a affidavit that states they are removing that vehicle from the state and will register it in another state, and the tax would be due in the other state.
Yes, you bet.
So in states that don't have sales tax, that wouldn't necessarily apply. And also, if they buy it here, should they be paying our sales tax?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, I guess I would be up to you folks to impose a tax on that because this exempts it.
Yeah, I mean, Ms. Henson, do you want to take a stab at that? And I can
Mr.
help if you
Chairman,
want.
Senator James, by the same token, if you buy a vehicle in a surrounding state and bring it back to Wyoming, that sales tax is due in Wyoming.
And this is kind of getting at the use tax thing as well, because you may buy something out of state, but when you bring it back into Wyoming, it actually doesn't matter whether you pay tax in another state or not. You're going to use it in Wyoming, you're going to pay it. But by implication, if you're not going to use something in Wyoming, it kind of is the other side of the question. Of course, we don't apply that to normal retail purchases, but vehicles are pretty important to people, and the sales tax and that whole issue is a big deal. So people are very careful about the sales tax piece. But go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just kind of stuck on the issue that residents are required to pay this tax, but non-residents aren't. Whether they're collecting it in a different state or not, residents are required to. Well, non-residents get the break. And, you know, that also kind of leads to a couple other questions. We were told that this couldn't happen. For instance, on the lodging tax, that we couldn't exempt certain people, but here it seems that we're doing that. So am I thinking of this correctly? Thank you.
Want to start?
Mr. Chairman.
Go
Senator
ahead, Ms.
James,
Lucero.
I think it's important to understand that we impose tax on motor vehicles based on the first registration. So when we purchase a vehicle, even out of state, first registration happens in Wyoming. Unless that state's law requires me to pay tax when I'm there. And there are some states like that. Arizona would require, if I went to Arizona and I purchased a vehicle there, they would require me to pay that tax there. Because their law requires it. Our law exempts it. Okay. So when I brought that vehicle back to Wyoming and registered it, I would show that I paid tax in another state. I would get credit for the tax I paid in another state, but if I didn't pay enough tax, that's where the use tax would come in, and I would owe the additional to Wyoming because first registration is happening in this state. So this exemption goes along with the imposition statute in 103, where it imposes tax on first registration. An out-of-state purchaser is not going to register their vehicle here. They're going to register it in another state, and they would be required to pay the tax there.
Okay.
If that
Thank you for,
helps.
that helps a lot. In terms of, Senator James, in terms of the lodging tax, I guess an out-of-state person is buying the lodging tax, buying lodging in the state. They're paying the state tax, just like if they bought a box of something, they would have to pay a tax on it as well. Because they are consuming it here. They're not taking it somewhere else. They have to consume lodging here, I guess I would have to say. And believe me, I'm not a fan of lodging taxes. I hate them all, so. Does that help? Go ahead.
But while it does explain what happens, it still doesn't solve the fact that we have to pay the tax and non-residents don't.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, certainly the exemption could be repealed if that is your preference, or it could be clarified. I think in some instances, it is the exemption itself is trying to recognize that taxpayer. And if the intent is truly in those situations where tax is required to be paid in another state, I believe the legislative intent is to not double up on that particular taxpayer. I understand your concern, and certainly that could be addressed statutorily, but in the big scheme of things, I think that that was probably what the legislature was trying to ensure against.
Okay. Let's keep moving on. This is so exciting.
The next exemption is for sales of lodging services offered by a county fair board during a county fair or other board authorized event.
When did we put that one in? And it has to do with Johnson County. I know it does. Because the commissioner's right back there. Yes, sir. Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm assuming that these are probably some sort of government entity employees that this would be referencing. If not, then why are we only exempting a small number of people from this lodging tax and service versus not making it fair across the board? Once again, if I'm understanding the wording correctly.
So I remember this one pretty well because Johnson county drug it out with a lawsuit between, wasn't it your assessor was trying to, someone was trying to impose taxes on the campers that were there for the county fair. And it was quite a row, and they came down and they got this exemption. And it's for like, when you go to the fair and you got your kids and they've got their lamb and their, this is for any member of the public that's camping at the fairgrounds during a county fair. Go ahead.
Thank you,
And
Mr. Chairman.
I'm just thinking of the AAA campgrounds. I remember having this discussion. It's all coming back in like these PTSD waves, but anyway, there you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it just seems like, once again, these people qualify for a lodging tax exemption, but others don't. So would you not agree?
Well, I certainly would, Senator James, but Ms. Arnold.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, I think this discussion is why I think it's important ever so often to go through these exemptions page by page and really have a heart to heart on, has our economy changed? Do the businesses and the composition of those businesses change? Do we need to fine tune some of these items? So certainly, the one thing about exemptions, regardless of which type of tax we're talking about, it is the purview of the legislature to either grant an exemption or deny, not put an exemption on the books. But that's how we reduce tax burden without bumping into any constitutional issues. And so every exemption you see that we're going to be discussing in the next couple of days is specific to something that happened that the legislature felt it would be appropriate to exempt that transaction. So I appreciate the discussion.
And I sincerely do as well. And the overwhelming theme that is back in my mind is that these are things that if it's done by a private provider, it's treated differently than if it's done by government. And you're going to see that theme also with other types of these exemptions. And there's a connection with the recreation services that we had earlier. It's become providing recreation to citizens is now a normal part of government, whether you like it or not. And yet that is a business enterprise for other people. Providing camping facilities is now kind of, at least for the county fair, is a normal part of government. So you want to see how government grows and moves into areas that clearly could be operated privately. These are textbook examples. And this was a hard fought exemption and they won it. The legislature approved it. This is a relatively new thing. And it was to settle a lawsuit, basically, or a dispute in the courts. I think it was in the courts. So if we had the policy will to do something about this, that'd be great. But last time we looked at all the exemptions, we ended up adding one. Remember that? I don't know. Nobody knows. So it's a terrible area. Please continue.
The rest of what you see here is the requirement for the Department of Revenue, Workforce Services, and the Wyoming Business Council to report on those specific exemptions that we talked about.
The
So,
5.
Yes.
Who's that? Oh, Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I've posed this question briefly to the department before, and I don't want to get too long-winded, but I'll probably have a follow-up. Does the department currently classify like cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, as a currency or a personal property?
Who's got that one? Ms. Can't do it. The old dog is just, go ahead, Ms. Henson.
I will respond to either, Mr. Chairman. At this particular point, as far as how the department recognizes it, it follows statutory. So the legislature defined that, included that in the definitions of intangible property. meaning that whether it's cash, gold, silver, digital currency, there are exemptions that cover those and so we basically treat them just as any other currency, and that's specific to statute.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess the conversation, like you said, often spurs different topics, and a new possible exemption that we could add would be, and it would go hand in hand with the blockchain committee, and the discussion would be the possibility of looking at exempting mining or minting, in that process in the future. So just posing it as a topic of future discussion or consideration.
Okay. It's always good to have more exemptions. Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope it's okay if I go back. I wanted to ask another question about the data center exemption, and I'm not really sure exactly how we can fix it, but it kind of concerns me on number 4, where we talk about we leave it up to the Wyoming Business Council to certify how many jobs they've created appropriate to the size of the data processing center. And I would just like to see that maybe be a little bit more black and white. Not that we don't trust the Wyoming Business Council, they do great work. But and also the fact that you guys have to wait till you receive that certification from them. I guess I want to know how that works out for you. And I know they have to report to us, but is there any way we could maybe make that a little more black and white and a little bit more clarification? Thank you.
Mr.
Mr.
Sarah?
Chairman, Senator Schuler, we don't, just to be clear, we don't wait for that certification from the Business Council. The data center has to receive that, and as part of their reporting to us, they're supposed to provide a copy of that. That certification is done once, to my knowledge. So at the beginning, when they start, I'm sure when they start building and are ready to take advantage of this exemption is when they do it. But the department is not involved in that much. So, but I just wanted to clarify that we don't wait for that. The actual data center is the one that applies for it and receives it. They just provide it to us. And if we have question, we contact the Business Council.
So just to be clear, it's a one-time kind of certification up front. And even though a data center, one thing we know about data centers is their equipment is robustly changed out. They have a lot of investment. The servers, I've heard like 3 years, and the whole thing's changed out or whatever. So they don't have to recertify. They just get an initial, and then everything they buy from then on is exempt. Would that be correct?
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, I think it's also one of those industries that to explore what are they doing? Are they simply, not simply, it's very technical, but the data service piece of it, but are they expanding? Those are different things that I think warrant investigation just into making sure that they aren't venturing into other areas that may be a taxable event. I think that discussion is going to be important as we move into our discussion of perhaps taxation of services and those types of things. But definitely those property owners that own data centers can articulate exactly what products or services that they provide to maybe enhance the way.
And
the
the
language is
thousands of
written.
people that they employ.
Absolutely.
Or not. Anyway, so I think we'll probably have a separate discussion on the merits of these exemptions. So hang around. Keep going.
I think, Mr. Chairman,
we're done.
that was our presentation related to sales and use tax exemptions and sunsets. I'll be happy to answer any questions specific to that before we move into consideration of taxation of services.
Anybody at this point in time? Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious if you happen to know how many exemptions apply to only sales with government versus private sector? And how that makes it harder for private sector to come in here when government's getting a better deal and it's directly competing with the private sector. Thank you.
Fair enough. Can we
Mr.
help with that one?
Chairman, Senator James, I don't know exactly right off the top of my head. I can
For
go
example,
through
the campground at the fairgrounds would
Sure,
certainly be
that
one.
The admissions to the municipal recreation centers, I guess that would be another one. Those are the two I can remember right off after just going through here.
So how about like utility services, for example? I don't, when we have water companies, that comes under the essential service thing. So a private water company, their service is taxed or not taxed? Probably not.
Water delivered by pipeline or truck is exempt. Is that what you're asking
Yeah.
about? Yes.
So I don't know about pipeline, but this would be at the
Yeah.
utility level. It's by pipe, but it's within the, there are private water companies in the state. And I don't know whether they pay taxes or not. I would guess they don't. For your household service.
Right. I
As
would
a
think that
utility.
they would fall under that exemption.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps as a topic of discussion in the future, we just look at the overall, instead of focusing on sales and use tax and governmental entities in comparison to private sector, maybe it's a broader discussion, whether it be related to property tax, sales and use tax, to just look at this. When does government enter private sector, whether it's services or sales, and then just determine, and I'm not saying to advocate an exemption or advocate taxation, but perhaps regardless of whether it's government or private sector, we treat them similar.
Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I noticed that it specifically says public utility, and I was just curious on how public utility is defined, whether that encompasses the private sector or not, if we could get a clear definition on that.
So I think that's fascinating. While you're looking, for example, the electric utility is a public utility. Okay, they're regulated by the, when you get your Rocky Mountain Power bill or whoever you have, it may be that my power bill has a sales tax. Okay. My water bill, which comes from the city, doesn't, I don't think. My gas bill, which comes from Black Hills, I bet does. I think it does. So, I mean, just think about that. And then does it matter if the electric company is a municipally owned electric company? We have several in Wyoming, many. So are those issues to think about? Is that fair? So I throw it back to Ms. Arnold or whoever.
Mr. Chairman, it should be noted on the public utilities, on those municipalities that own their utilities, they do pay property tax. We treat them just as we do any other public utility. So, but definitely we can look at those.
Do they pay
related
sales
to-
tax or not? I don't know the answer.
I believe the imposition, I don't have the imposition statute in front of me, but I believe it imposes tax for all.
Okay,
electric,
but not for water.
not water.
Why is one more important than the other? Try living without electricity. It's very fascinating to me. It doesn't make any sense.
Mr. Chairman, I think that exemption came about because of an oil and gas issue many years ago. And the former director, Barton, said during a legislative session that she thought we just started to tax water. And that's where that exemption came around, as I recall, way back. I believe it came out of a discussion that related to oil and gas somehow.
Actually, that makes total sense in Wyoming. Thank you very much for that. Great memory. Representative Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one more comment just along those lines, kind of related to the data centers and the products that they produce. And I think that there is going to be kind of a migration to the producing of the digital currency. So I think it's a very relevant question that we have to keep in the back of our mind. And also when we as a state endorse, you know, a partnership between these cryptocurrencies companies, like with the University of Wyoming, for example, I think this private-public partnership and this conflict between what's taxed and what isn't taxed, I think there's something there that the committee's probably going to have to look at in the future.
I think you're probably right. Thank you. Anybody else? Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So under Roman numeral 3, and then big E, where it talks about the sales of power, fuel to a person engaged in the transportation business, in the statute, it refers to a terminal rack, Wyoming terminal rack. Are those only government owned, or do private sector own those? Just want to get clarification on that.
I apologize,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. Could you clarify which statute? We're just wanting to make sure that we're,
Oh, Mr. Chairman, it's still under 3915-105. Little a, Romanet 3, big E. I'll be on.
I think that's referring to what's called the rack for where fuel is blended, if I remember right. I bet there's somebody in the audience who could help us with that. Maybe not. Nobody's volunteered.
The terminal rack is not used in the documents that you gave us. It's within the statutes. I believe it was under 3917-101 is where I found it.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, those are fuel tax statutes. So I'm assuming they are talking about the terminal racks maybe at a refinery or something, but I can't profess to be.
Sheila, do you know the answer to that? Yes. Thank you. We were just getting clarification for anybody watching online about what rack that is, and Ms. Forsyth explained that it's probably at the refinery rack. So thank you very much. Senator James.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to help businesses know all their exemptions, would it be possible for you guys to work with the Secretary of State when businesses get a license or renew or whatever? They're very aware of the details of what their business is. Would you guys be able to ensure that those businesses know everything that they're exempt from, as well as everything that they need to pay, so that way they're squared away?
Well,
Ms. Henson.
Mr. Chairman, Senator James, definitely we can work with them. I think it's important to note that there are numerous businesses that register with the Secretary of State's office that don't have a presence in Wyoming. So for example, property taxes wouldn't be applicable, different things, but definitely, even if it's, we know that customers, taxpayers, businesses coming to our state typically use the internet as their resource. And I'm not sure if there's a link to the Department of Revenue website from the Secretary of State's, but I will definitely check into that and see what we can come up with.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Senator
Mr.
James,
Sarah.
we also do for any in-state business when they license with us. So when they get their sales tax license, we have field reps located throughout the state, and those field representatives receive those licenses and they contact those vendors and they go and deliver that license and educate that taxpayer on not only exemptions, but what they have to pay tax on and those kinds of things. So in about 95% of the time, those in-state businesses are getting personal education upfront on that on the information that's pertinent to their business. At least that is the attempt from the department.
So we good at this point? Does anybody in the audience have a burning desire to jump into what we've discussed so far? If not, we're going to start discussing basically services and sales tax on services. So anybody? Anybody online? We good to go ahead? All right, let's tax services. Go ahead. I didn't just say that, did I? Let's look at tax and services. Maybe that sounds softer.
Mr. Chairman,
Who's Representative Sweeney?
just a quick question on that. The chart that I had from 2020 appears to have a lot more detail on almost every one of the categories. Is there a reason the same format wasn't followed?
It should be relatively.
Go ahead, Ms.
Sorry,
Lucero.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, this should be relatively the same handout. It may have different services on it, but it should have the taxable sales that we used from South Dakota, and then the adjustment for Wyoming's population, the potential revenue at the average state rate, and then the split between the general fund and local governments. Is there something more on what you have?
Mr. Chairman, just in
Go ahead.
particular, the 2020 under agricultural had, and perhaps the answer is they were aggregated under lawn and garden services, but as an example, ornamental shrub and tree services were listed separately at 21,300,000, but that in the 2020 version. So
Did you say oriental or ornamental?
I don't know what. did I say?
I think my ears are
So-
fogging up. Anyway, okay, ornamental shrubs.
or-
What happened to ornamental shrubs? Did they all die in the winter?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, I'm not, I took these services from the last bill. I believe that came through last year, just as an example. And then went to South Dakota's report of their services, and that's where I got it. They may very well list ornamental shrubs separately, and maybe that's why it was listed separately last year. I can certainly look because I have that information here, but I don't recall.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, Representative Sweeney. So let's talk about these services, okay?
So I was going to start out by saying, yes, these services I picked just from a bill that kind of laundry listed them last year,
Uh-huh.
and then went through how South Dakota lays these out and what's included under those. So these aren't all encompassing services. They are just services that I used from one of the bills from last year. So there was multiple bills last year that talked about expanding the tax base and taxing services. So again, some of them included even repealing exemptions. So if Wyoming was to impose tax on these services, which include at the broad level, agricultural services, did you want me to go through what these include in each section?
I
Or
suppose, if you don't mind.
so under agricultural services, it included veterinary services, specialties, landscape counseling and planning, and lawn and garden services.
So and that's just a classification. I mean, I can understand like veterinary and stuff that ag uses, but landscape counseling and planning and lawn and garden services, that's not exactly agriculture in my mind. I mean, You're not making your living. So help me with this.
So, Mr. Chairman, typically tracking of all of these industries is done by NAICS code.
NAICS code, yeah.
And so that's the major category on the NAICS code. But, you know, and we use that NAICS code, it used to be called the SIC code.
SIC.
Yes, the Standard Industrial Classification. But it serves as a concise way for statutes to be constructed where you can say, you know, industries under this NAICS code are included or not included, those types of things. But certainly as this document was compiled, that was the route that when you see those major categories, they're specific to a NAICS code that the major NAICS code.
And yeah, and just to tag on that a little bit, every major NAICS code will have subcodes. So these will actually have a subcode,
That's
but
correct.
if we give exemptions by the major code, I mean, honestly, so lawn and garden services are not taxed. You know, and landscape counseling and planning. So if you go to a landscape designer and they drop a set of plans, that's not taxed. Now, how many people go to landscape designers? You know, I mean, honestly, you think about the implications of this stuff, and it's obviously it's not a lot of, not a whole bunch of money, but lawn and gardening services, that's $100 million. So there's $4 or $5 million in taxes in that. And you can always mow your own lawn. Okay, keep going.
Mr. Chairman, the next classification would be business services. Under that classification, some of those services that had been kind of pulled out of that classification was commercial art and graphic design, court reporting services, disinfecting and pest control services, building maintenance services, computer programming services, data processing services, and business services not elsewhere classified. So those were some of the services listed in that major NAICS code. The next group under the engineering and management services includes engineering services, architectural services, surveying services, accounting and auditing and bookkeeping, commercial research, testing laboratories, management services, management consulting services, facility support services, and real estate agents and managers. The next set of services listed is under personal services. So beauty shops, barber shops, tax return preparation services, and miscellaneous services not elsewhere classified. Amusement and recreation services. This is where your dance halls, your bowling centers, physical fitness centers, public golf courses, memberships to sports clubs, and amusement and recreation not elsewhere classified would fit. And
Does
then-
anybody know if there's a dance hall in Wyoming anywhere? I love that concept. Anyway, thank you. Certainly there are studios and schools.
And the next is legal services. I think there was one bill last year that included legal services and taxing services, so I left that on there. So those are all the services that we looked at, and I included information on the spreadsheet for the repeal of the manufacturing machinery exemption and the data center exemption, only because that was listed in one of the draft bills last year. So it was just, and since we'd already talked about it, I left it in there to show the difference. So basically what that spreadsheet shows is if we were to tax that, it's estimated that the increase in tax collections could be about $81.1 million. If you also chose to repeal those two exemptions, the manufacturing machinery and the data center, based on our respondents to our survey this year, we could we could get 20.6 million in additional sales tax collections in the state. Again, like I said, there were several bills last year that imposed tax on these services and also repealed either those exemptions or some other exemptions. There is a lot of differing draft bills. But almost all of them created a different distribution for the sales tax. Just either an increased amount would be distributed some other way, or the services that tax would be distributed some other way than the normal tax is today. And so I think it's important to point out that anytime we have to change or add distribution rules into our accounting engine of the excise tax division, that programming is very, very expensive. And it's labor intensive as well as time consuming because of the amount of time it takes for us to test that programming to ensure that those tax dollars will get distributed appropriately. In some of the cases, the way the bills were written, one of them, I think the tax on the services was going to go a completely different way. And the only way we would have known how to distribute that was to not only program the distribution changes, but also create a new form for those vendors that actually report that, for us to identify what tax should be distributed as that bill said. So those fiscal notes had a pretty big administrative impact to the department because the programming is expensive and the time that it takes to test and then implement this. So it took longer to implement these taxes because of the change in distribution. So it might be, as an alternative, better to look at least investigating, leaving the distribution the same as it's statutorily required today, and then maybe moving that money around once those deposits are made to the general fund as an alternative.
It's probably good advice. Questions at this point? Representative Sweeney got me first. I'm sorry.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm just curious on the 2020 report. One of the biggies back a year ago was healthcare services, which is back then was just under $4 billion. And the total services total at that point was, and this is part of the difference, is why I point out healthcare was 6.7 billion versus what you're showing in the new taxable services total 2.3 billion. Could you explain?
Ms. Lucero.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, these figures were updated for 2021 figures, and some of those figures did go down. So that's part of it. And then I did not include healthcare services on this, as the majority of the bills did not include healthcare, so I just left it off. We can do it any way you like. If you want to see other.
Mr. Chairman, definitely, this is not an all-inclusive list. We truly did just focus on proposed legislation during the last session. But, as you know, Representative Sweeney, the South Dakota taxes a lot. So there is information there that we can glean some sort of an estimate or an indication. So, I mean, certainly if you don't have access to that, we can actually provide access to that South Dakota, and we could run the numbers in a spreadsheet for every one of those details. So be happy to do that if you'd like. And I just wanted to follow up, Mr. Chairman, on those fiscal notes. I think that clarification, knowing that those financial requirements, anytime you change that distribution, that's where the heavy lift is going to be. And when we look at the exemptions and we look at taxability, trying to determine that how the changes in our economy and the business functions, I think are we really just capturing a tax source that was really historically something that we possess, but now it's a service? Those are the things we need to discuss. But really, for the Department of Revenue, as long as the distribution remains the same, what it involves for us is the education piece, educating those new, they're vendors in our eyes, but they're vendors of the services. And so we just need we need to be able to reach out and educate those folks in how to collect those taxes and how to remit those taxes. So it definitely would be additional staff, but in the long run, the cost is not substantial for that revenue. Thank you.
Mr. Co-Chairman? I'm sorry, your light's still on? Okay, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for all the information. I think, so as this sheet on services, as you explained, I mean, there's many more NAICS codes, a lot more detail. These are broad categories like the chairman talked today, about ag things as far as landscape. I mean, there's like pet grooming and all those things are listed in ag. So, I mean, there's some ag services we probably wouldn't have support or want to tax, but I mean, just so folks, I mean, pet grooming is an ag service. Boarding your animals, those kind of things. So all that's real good. But okay, so my question then really, and I sent this sheet to the committee and our staff, and it's an LSO product, but it breaks these more NAICS codes and shows kind of all these services and just kind of, South Dakota has, first of all, they have a higher rate than us, right? They're 4.5 state rate, we're 4, and then their local taxes are considerably higher. I don't know what their average is, probably 7 or more. Ours is 5.35. But at the bottom of that spreadsheet I sent out to all the members here, I mean, South Dakota taxes 152 services, we tax 66. That's just off of a sheet from a year ago, that we worked on. And I guess I'd like your comments really, and I remember it's really Chairman Madden who used to talk about this on the floor of the House, because this is not a new thing. Sales, the way we spend our money has changed, just like we had to adapt to do online sales, right? We were one of the last states to do that before buying and hurting our brick and mortar, the competition piece. But there's also now this issue, and I remember Chairman Madden standing in the back of the House, he'd hold his hands like this and say 40, 50 years ago, 60, 70% of our money we spent were on goods. 30, 40% on services. And now slowly over time, last half century, that's reversed. 60, 70% of our money now is spent on services. And I just remember that, and other states have, obviously adapted and adjusted. Wyoming, I think we want to remain a non-income tax state, even though we have the richest county in America. I just don't, that's for a different generation of Wyomingites long after we're all gone. But just modernize, your topic on here was to modernize this. Any comments you guys have been experts in this area for a long time. So any kind of thoughts on that about this shift and what other states are doing? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Who wants to help?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I do know and have done actually seminars with the state of South Dakota, and they do tax almost everything. And it is evident from their collections versus ours, even though they're a bigger state, that there is a larger percentage of income spent on services these days than used to be. And so, yeah, I think that it's important for us to always look at the changing economy and the changing way that people spend their money, because it is changing.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we talked about this, and it's not about raising our rate. 4% or 5.3 average. Really broadening this to make sure, look similar to what we did with the internet sales tax, broadening that out. That's really the way, because it's changed, economy's changed. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Don't you agree? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Henson.
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Harshman, I think as we investigate this, we're really looking at what are we considering a transaction that's a taxable event, whether it be services, commodities, tangible, intangible. That's where that discussion is just, what is considered a transaction and what tax is applicable in that particular situation. And hopefully via these discussions, we can find where is that. We're seeing our sales tax numbers, our collections are increasing. Correct. But it's because of that expanse and the Wayfair decision and those types of things. But, where would our sales tax revenues have been had those items not taken place? And so we really are just trying to follow the economy and what is happening in the marketplace. And so hopefully this will be a discussion that will kind of get the public's input as to what do they believe. Because I've seen numerous studies in different organizations, and I will tell you that from the public's perspective, sales tax seems to be something that they prefer over a property tax increase or an income tax. So I would always encourage the legislature to use what we already have, those statutes, those programs, software that we already have in place, and build on that. And that way there isn't such a cost to implement. So hopefully we'll weed through all of these considerations as we go through this process.
Okay. So I'm trying to figure out how we want to manage this time here. We could continue the discussion of exemptions because and services because we're really not quite done there. And we could also consider the distribution piece. And I'd kind of like the Department of Revenue to tell us a little bit about how we distribute now, because we have the 3 cents, then we change it for the 4 cents, and then we have our local government partners, and they get a share of all this. And it might be useful to have some of that, but I don't want to do it now. And I was thinking maybe we could do that when we come back from lunch. In order to kind of direct this, I would ask if there's anybody in the public that can't be here after lunch and wishes to talk to the committee now. And I'd certainly let you do that. But we are going to come back to all these sales tax issues. We're not done with them. So any member of the public need to talk to the committee right now before we break for lunch? Ms. Arnold, would this work? We'll just take a break for lunch and we'll just pick this back up and committee, see if there's a plan that emerges and we'll go from there. Anybody online? Katie, we got anything online? All right, so I think it's going pretty well. I think we got farther this morning than I had actually planned. So I'm thinking we might be able to stretch lunch till 1:30. Is that okay with the committee, with Mr. Co-Chairman? Are you okay with that? Is that okay with everybody? That gives you a little bit of time. We're not exactly closest place is the country club. You can probably get there in and out in an hour, but I don't know that. So with everybody's indulgence, let's come back at 1:30. Thank you.